All right. How do I do this? Okay, so let's see if I can just do this. Oops. Now what are we seeing? Now we're just seeing my desktop.
Amol ist unser Leben gegangen unterwegs. Mit Amol tut bloß und gießen nach Regen. Schreit der Rebbe zu der Chmare her und gießt im Wasser. Einen alle Chassidim. Chiribim, chiribim, bom, 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 chiribim, chiribom, chiribim, bom, 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 bom. Deine Zähne weiße Perlach, wie deine schöne Augen, deine Kinderlach, deine Herrlach, hast mich zugezogen, schön wie Wille Worte, lichtig wie die Sterne, du Himmel am Matone, bist du mir zugeschickt. Bei mir bist du schön, bei mir hast du kein, bei mir bist du eine Reut der Welt. Bei mir bist du Kind, bei mir hast du ich, bei mir bist du Teierer von Geld. Wir scheine hier, ja Toben, schön gewollt, nehmen nicht, und von sei alle Häuser glieden. Hab ich nur dir, bei mir bist du schön, bei mir hast du kein, bei mir bist du eine Roll der Chiribim, chiribom, chiribim, bom, 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 chiribim, chiribom, chiribim, bom, 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 chiribiri, biri, 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 bom, 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 chiribiri, biri, 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 bim, chiribim, bom, 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 bom. Ay, Romania, 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 Romania. Giving a land, Aziz Shana. Ay, Romania, 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 Romania. Giving a land, Aziz Shana. Dazu wollen es vergnügen, wo das Herzblut kannst du kriegen. Amamalegala, Abahastramala, Akaharnatsala, Unaglaze la Wein trinkt man überall, wie verwischt mit Kostweiler. Das kann nicht sein. Ei am Argen liegen, no was Rumänisch rein. Ei gewaltig wärme Schiege, liebender Brinzer, Mama Liga, tanzen freizig dich das Stelle, dann ich wächst auf Apnoschala. Ei digidam, 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 ei digidam, 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 ei Sesama, ei das kann nicht sein. Ei am Argen liegen, no was Rumänisch rein.
Spanish wine. That is the champagne wine. Or is that the expensive kind? Is that Morgen-David wine? That is Morgen-David wine. If that's Morgen-David wine, that is nicht the expensive wine.
Okay. Were you all just like looking at my like desktop screen with my like Gmail or something? I'm totally inept at Zoom, so I have no idea what you're all just looking at. Anyway, I'll try to fix it. So yeah, I'm Zach, and Michael invited me to be part of Festiwal because my cousin pressured me into starting a stupid meme page and music project about a year and a half ago. And yeah, called Fully Automated Luxury Kosher Space Kibbutz. Get onto the reason, like where that name comes from in a bit, because that's kind of what I'm talking about today. And yeah, the songs we just played are sort of like remixes of Yiddish songs, which is kind of, yeah, I started making remixes of Yiddish songs as well. And yeah, those are just sort of like the originals with extra bass and drums and weird sort of glitch effects. Someone's trying to call me, shut up. So yeah, so when Michael first asked me to do this thing, I kind of tried to back out because I don't really know anything about these lucky Jews, these lucky Jew figurines, but he said, oh, that's fine. I've got enough people talking about that. You can just talk about whatever you like. So I'm, yeah, taking extreme latitude and talking about something that doesn't really have much to do with Poland or lucky Jews. Although I did try to write this very long tangential introduction, trying to link I'm talking about to lucky Jews, but it was way too much of a reach. But let me try to do it in like one sentence. And that is the question, how do we create an egalitarian society in which people don't feel the need to turn to bizarre superstitions like these lucky Jew talismans out of desperation? As I'm sure you've heard the saying, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. So my question is, what is the 21st century socialism of not fools? The non-foolish 21st century socialism. So let me just sort of paint a picture first of like some of what I would say are some of the biggest issues happening right now. Firstly, as I'm sure you probably all know, income inequality has increased in most developed countries and some middle income countries, including China, which is the world's fastest growing economy. Since like the 70s, the richest 1% of the population have been the big winners in the sort of neoliberal shift in the global economy, while at the other end of the scale, the bottom 40% are earning less than a quarter of income worldwide. The United Nations is warning that climate change is threatening to undo the last 50 years of progress in development, global health and poverty reduction. And even the, increasingly unrealistic best case scenario of 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming by 2100 will see extreme temperature fluctuations in many regions and leave massive populations of people with food insecurity, lost incomes and poor health. Meanwhile, a new machine age threatens ever greater technological unemployment as progressively more physical and cognitive labor is performed by machines rather than humans, swelling the already growing surplus of global poor who form an ever larger unnecessariat, which is a sort of play on the term precariat, which is like someone in precarious employment. Simultaneously, stagnating or declining real wages and growth of in-work poverty, increasing consumer debt and flatlining national growth in much of the global north has led to this sort of groundswell in radical movements on both the left and right, as you see in like the sort of groundswell of support for people like Corbyn and Sanders, and also Brexit and Trump. But yeah, the first half of that equation is a groundswell of what seems to be like global progressive movements, millennials and Gen Zers, sort of people, generations who are feeling sort of deprived of stability, security, and the promise of a better future, unlike their parents, are coalescing into new formations on the internet and on the streets. So there is a sense of strength, and there is also sort of disunity, sectarianism, disagreements over quote unquote identity politics, fidelity to true Marxism, the value of electoral politics, the role of traditional leftist institutions like unions, etc., etc. And there are also attempts to sketch some vague contours of sort of a promised land, utopian futurist visions that seek to forge unity based on a shared vision of a radically egalitarian economy and society. As this guy I like called Aaron Van Sitchian wrote, after decades of neoliberal cutbacks and in the face of climate disaster, something new is appearing on the horizon, the willingness to think big. With the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, the left has caught on to a wave of hope and humor, rejecting self-flagellation and hand-wringing to sincerely embrace positive visions of the future. There is a new kind of socialist futurism in the air, best encapsulated by memes like acid Corbynism and fully automated luxury communism. What unites such visions of the future is that they do not seek to reject modernity, as is often done on the left. Rather, they fully embrace its possibilities. Many adherents view themselves as properly Marxist. As the Communist Manifesto points out, while capitalism continuously tears us apart, it also creates an awesome global infrastructure and culture that offers the conditions of its own destruction. So I'm going to talk about mainly one of these radical futurist sort of manifestos, which is fully automated luxury communism. This guy. Not because I'm like a, massive fanboy of it necessarily, but partly because it's a good place to start, especially if we want to think about some of the, the big crises that are happening in capitalist modernity and what might make a radically progressive society different. So, it's kind of the term, I guess although he uses the word communist in the title, the term post-capitalist is the name that's sort of coalesced around a number of popular books that have come out in the last decade, like fully automated luxury communism, and this one, it's called Inventing the Future by Nick Srinacek and Alex Williams. And so all these books look at the trajectories of artificial intelligence, automation, renewable energy, and see a permanent crisis for capitalism. They also see new conditions, new possibilities that require the left to embrace the possibilities of the future of technological modernity, but not just to sort of accept the given conditions of the present, but to sort of blast beyond them, to smash through the ceiling. And so it's not just like unconditional accelerationism, political governance. They still want political governance to act as a sort of moderating influence on technological development. But in their opinion, government should also seek to drive and accelerate new technologies. This is partly just for technical reasons, like the belief that we're not going to be able to address crises like climate change without extreme acceleration in new technology, like the efficiency of solar photovoltaic cells, etc. But it's also kind of political. This sort of embrace of technology, and that's because the left, in their estimation, has been hamstrung by what they call a sort of regressive folkiness, like a preference for the immediate, the local, a sort of general rejection of modernity, blah blah blah, and they point to sort of things like Occupy, like the Occupy movement as an example. Anyway, so I'm mainly going to talk about Aaron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism for a few reasons. Firstly, he has a lot of similar arguments to Srinacek and Williams, but maybe later on we can talk about some of the ways they diverge. Also, Bastani spends more of the book considering climate change as a serious problem, compared to Srinacek and Williams, which doesn't really take that into account as much. Also, this is just going to go for way too long if I don't narrow it down, because I wrote 25,000 words, as I do, just 25,000 meandering words that just trail off into weird conclusions that probably don't make sense. Yeah. Also, as you know, it's the inspiration for my meme page's name. I think before I even heard of the book, I heard of this whole, there was this whole internet meme about fully automated luxury gay space communism. And I just thought it was such a funny slogan. It's a funny, kitschy thing. And, it was humorous, but also utopian, which I thought, which is promised this, it was part of this sort of vibrant, but also vibrant, humorous, and I don't know, ambitious sort of left-wing online culture that I really liked. I was also reading a lot of sort of eco-socialist and other ecological things at the time, and I wasn't just yep, sweet, let's get on the Millennium Falcon of, leftist hyperfuturism. But yeah, I did think it was funny and new, and yeah. Anyway, I think I made a joke to my cousin. I was like, hey, we got fully automated luxury gay space communism, but where's the fully automated luxury kosher space kibbutz? And then they were like, Cool. That's funny. I've made you a Facebook page, by the way, with that name. Now you have to make memes. And so then I just started shit posting stupid stuff. And now we have like 10,000 followers. Don't know how that happened. Anyway, so let's get into the book. Let's get into the book. Fully Automated Luxury Communism. So, the thesis of the book is basically orbits the sort of transcendence of 5 crises, which Bastani sees as the 5 most significant long-term trajectories happening right now, which are, as I already kind of mentioned above, climate change and the consequences of global warming, resource scarcity, particularly mineral resources for energy and also fresh water, societal aging as life expectancy increases and birth rates concurrently fall, which will present a massive challenge to socialized healthcare systems, a growing surplus of global poor who form an ever larger unnecessariat, I wrote before, which is, so this unnecessariat is sort of like the combined result of a growing population and number 5, which is this new machine age, ever greater technological unemployment as progressively more physical and cognitive labor is performed by machines. Rather than like retreat away from these new technologies and threats or adopt a sort of precautionary principle, like let's use less energy or impede the development of new robotics and AI to preserve jobs, Bastani thinks that the left should accelerate the development of new technology, which he thinks is already kind of bursting at the seams of capitalism. And I'll explain why that is in a bit. But what he thinks we should do is sort of accelerate this technology and drive, or like stir up a sort of socio-political uprising, I guess, that sort of seeks to put this kind of technology, the technological trajectory in the hands of the people, or at least a democratically elected welfare state. So technological development is oriented towards social ends and not the maximization of profit. Basically what he believes is that exponential growth in automation, AI, silicon transistors, like the miniaturization of silicon transistors, ever increasing computer power, asteroid mining, and increasing efficiency in like, renewable technologies like lithium battery storage and solar photovoltaic could lead to extreme supply of information, energy resources, and even life itself, in the form of life-saving drugs and medical procedures. In other words, a situation of post-scarcity, which could lead to a society in which work, here meant as like unwanted drudgery or, alienated work in Marxist parlance, is increasingly minimized, and meaningful work done voluntarily because you have a passion for it, is maximized. So does anyone have any questions before I keep going?
Hey, Zach, do you want us to be asking questions throughout?
Yeah.
How would you like this to go? Like, maybe can you give us some rules or boundaries around how you'd like this to go?
Totally. Yeah, well, I guess I wrote so much because I was a kind of, as an insurance in case no one asked any questions. So I probably have enough to just like ramble on for 4 hours, but I don't want to do that because I'll probably just lose my voice. So yeah, please, I intend for this ideally to be a conversation. And so, but also I don't claim to be like an expert. So please ask me a question, but I might not be able to answer it, but maybe hopefully someone else here might be able to answer it. Or even if it's not a question, if there's something that you take issue with, or, something that just springs into mind because of something I say, something you'd like to share and with everyone else, and hopefully, encourage other people to, you know, expand on whatever idea you share, etc. Yeah, just yeah. I can also ask questions of you. But yeah, I don't know if I have any yet to ask you, but I do probably have lots later, lots and lots later. But so maybe I'll just keep going for a bit more, unless any of you have any questions right now. Yeah, and you can, I don't care, like you can have your screens off or on. I don't mind, whatever. Have a fake name and have your screen off, or have your real name and have your screen on. Put yourself out there. I just doxed myself this week, so, you know, I haven't been killed yet or faced a torrent of online abuse by, you know, right-wing Zionists. So I think it could be okay. All right, so no questions. Doxed how? Oh, I mean, like I doxed myself. Like before this, I didn't like I didn't have attach my name to this Facebook page, and then and then Michael asked me to do this, and I was like, all right, I'll just like dox myself. Maybe out of, you know, hunger for fame secretly. Who knows? Maybe pure ego. So I'm going to explain what I meant before when I said that, or what Bustani means when he writes that technology or technological development is at the moment is sort of threatening to burst at the seams of capitalism. And primarily what this means is this idea of like rapidly declining marginal costs. So I'll give an example. Well, I'll give his example, and then I'll sort of maybe try to break it down a little bit. So he writes that he's talking about like Napster, which I guess was like one of the first file sharing services that really disrupted the music industry. And he says, well, he's quoting these two economists, and he says, the most basic condition for economic efficiency is that price equals marginal costs. But with information goods, the social and marginal cost of distribution is close to zero. So yeah, like obviously with like torrenting or just digital music, you just Control-C, Control-V, you can just infinitely replicate music. So once the fixed cost of music is paying for a recording studio or paying for a producer, whatever. But once you have the product, one recording of music, the marginal cost, which is like the additional cost of producing additional items of music. So the difference between having one album of, you know, fully automated luxury kosher space kibbutz music and 1,000 is just a matter of pressing Control-C, Control-V 1,000 times, or having, you know, just putting it online and letting people download it 1,000 times. It's a very small marginal cost compared to something like a car, you know, like every time you want another car, you have to build a whole other car. Anyway, so his basic argument is that this idea of like rapidly declining marginal costs is increasingly holding true for like films, books, music, and academic papers, as you might guess, like PDFs, obviously, but also for like, you know, the designs of industrial robots or pharmaceutical drug, and that this trend is going to hold true for ever increasing amounts of the economy. And so that's kind of like the paradox that of technological development and capitalism today, in which, so if capitalism is a system in which things are produced for exchange or profit, but if informational goods are distributed at their marginal cost of production, which in this case is increasingly trending towards zero, as he argues, they can't be created and produced by entrepreneurial firms that use revenues obtained from sales to consumers to cover their costs. Like, so firms, you know, creating informational goods for a profit, you know, it doesn't work if the marginal cost is zero. And so I guess that's why you get things like, you know, Netflix or something like Netflix with a subscription model, which kind of imposes artificial scarcity on what is essentially a zero marginal cost, infinite resource. Like you could just, you know, it doesn't matter if 3 or 3 million people are watching a Netflix show at the same time. You know, the marginal cost is basically only in Netflix servers, but it's not big. But, you know, anyway, they've got to cover the fixed costs, and so they've got a subscription service, you need a password, etc., etc. So there's obviously like an argument about whether this idea of plummeting marginal costs actually does hold true for like ever increasing swaths of the economy. Does anyone feel like it's just sort of Silicon Valley bullshit, or does it sound intuitively right to people? We can get into this later as well if people don't.
Zach, I think you're exactly right. There's always that initial upfront cost, which might be really significant. So the effective price of producing just one more item might be 0 of Windows 10, but making the first copy might still be $100 million. And so that, yeah, I guess everything that you're saying is consistent with that, but I just sort of wanted to that's a particular challenge for capitalism or any other system, is how to cope with the large upfront cost as well as the 0 marginal cost.
Yeah, totally. Obviously, like Windows would be an example where that fixed cost is really high, as opposed to other kinds of informational goods. But yeah, essentially it becomes the information is the source of value for that product, right? It's not, for Windows, it's not really like the capital or the labor. It is that partly, but it's also just the information. So if Microsoft loses control over the code, like for how to build Microsoft Word, their product kind of, you know, like they lose, you know, their sort of their profit structure, right?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's still that difficult thing, like they've got to employ, extract a whole lot of labor out of a bunch of coders to write that initial code. So in some senses, that is like a production line, like very labor intensive to sort of write that first version. It sort of actually looks a bit like the old economy in some ways. It might be an extreme example to use that actually is maybe an exception to the rule, but it's just something that's jumping out at me.
Oh yeah, no, totally. Well, that's the thing. He's mainly only talking about marginal costs, not fixed costs. So yeah, like the fixed costs of all these things are still massive. Like, you know, making a Netflix documentary takes millions of dollars. Making software takes millions of dollars, you know.
It also makes me think about, this might be going off on a tangent and not super relevant, but someone was explaining to me about, you know, like the cloud and how we think of the cloud as this, you know, you save something on the cloud and it lasts forever. And someone who's like, a friend who's like visited like, you know, one of these like server storage places is saying like, actually like all that information is stored physically on a server, you know, and sometimes that will like break down or overheat, or, you know, you can still, and, you know, you might lose that information. So it's not, so I don't know, there's something about the way that we consume media and information and music through the internet, and how we imagine it like kind of just in the air and on your computer, and, you know, that's removed from the physical nature of how like that information is stored and kept. which I don't know, I find interesting on some level. I don't know if that's tied into.
No, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's kind of like one of the big critiques of this book that I'll get into later, but it's like, yeah, all of this stuff does have a physical infrastructure, which, you know, is kind of occluded by using language like the cloud. That makes it seem like it is this, you know, just sort of like ephemeral, ethereal thing floating in the sky. But yeah, I think sometimes like if you upload a photo, it'll be stored on like multiple server farms for security. And these are like, yeah, massive facilities where they've, you know, they can just consume so much electricity because they have to keep all these servers cool. And yeah, I've seen some pretty amazing stats. I can't remember what it is. I think it's like someone's predicted that by 2050, the internet could use up to like a quarter of electricity worldwide, just for like this huge glut of data that we have. So yeah, totally. Like a lot of this Silicon Valley, all this kind of like techno, you know, utopian stuff. Yeah, it does often seem like it's just talking about software and not hardware. Did I follow on from your thought enough, Rachel? Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, I don't know, it just came to mind. And yeah, not having read the book, I'm not sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure if that kind of comes into play. Yeah.
No, totally. Yeah, like a lot of the way these kind of people write about technology, like zero marginal cost, digital information economies, and like 3D printing. Sometimes it's like as if these things aren't real physical things that have a real physical infrastructure and a real environmental cost. You know, totally. Yeah. Like I said, I'm not here to like defend this guy.
No.
Or this argument. I'm just here to like explore it.
Maybe I veered away from your train of thought as well. Sorry.
No, I love. No, please do not feel shy about sharing any thoughts, no matter how tangential they seem. Does anyone else have anything to say before I continue on my merry way? No? Okay. So I'm going to sort of go into the next section of the book where he goes into like 5 different aspects of the global system that he thinks are moving towards a sort of a situation of post-scarcity. So the first one is full automation, which is post-scarcity in labor. And so he starts off by saying that like even though economic output has been growing in a lot of sectors like heavy industry and manufacturing, there is a declining number of people employed in those sectors. And so of course, like, you know, when you think heavy industry and manufacturing are like the sectors that you would sort of intuitively think would be the first to be automated, which is true, but we'll get onto like automation in other sectors later. So Bastani quotes this thing from, it's like this 1983 quote from the Nobel Prize winning economist Wassily Leontiev, probably butchering that name, who believed that human labor in the 21st century would come to resemble horses at the turn of the 20th century. And so this sort of key source of value creation, like obviously for thousands of years, you know, horses were this integral part of the European economy, or the Australian economy. If you think about like, well, not even just like all over the world, basically. I don't know if you think about how important brumbies were or how important horses were in the sort of colonization and the agricultural expansion of Australia. And then at the end of the 20th century, it was like suddenly, the beginning of the 20th century, horses kind of became this like redundant technology. And so they just sort of cut all the horses loose and then, well, some of them escaped, but you know, I think that's a big part of why we have this like feral horse problem in Australia, is that they did become this increasingly obsolete technology. Not totally, obviously, they still use horses for like droving and stuff. Anyway, But anyway, the point is that like this key source of value creation and wealth, whether it's horse-powered labor or human-powered labor, would become obsolete. And this guy says, computers and robots will replace humans in the exercise of mental functions in the same way as mechanical power replaced them in the performance of physical tasks. As time goes on, more and more complex mental functions will be performed by machines. And this means that the role of humans as the most important factor of production is bound to diminish, in the same way that the role of horses in agricultural production was first diminished and then eliminated by the introduction of tractors. Yeah, he uses this very funny term to explain it. He calls it like peak horse, like, you know, peak oil or something. But it's like, yeah, 1920s was peak horse, and since then it's just been a decline. So let's go into like, you know, he's basically, this chapter is just him going through different sectors of the economy and looking at what's happening in terms of automation. So first one is manufacturing, and I'll just dump some stats on you that you'll just to give you an idea. So from 1980 to 2000 roughly, the US steel industry increased output from 75 to 125 million tons, while the number of workers declined from 289,000 to 74,000. So that is almost a doubling of steel production and almost like a threefold at least decline in the number of people actually working in the industry. The US lost 2 million manufacturing jobs to automation, just about 11% of the sector. I think that's between 97 and 2005. Oh no, that was before then. Sorry, lost in the stats. Sorry, from 97 to 2005, US manufacturing output increased by another 60%, while almost 4 million more jobs in the sector disappeared, which is interesting because you sort of think of that period as like, you know, the neoliberal period or the outsourcing period when a lot of these manufacturing jobs were shipped to places like China. But if you look at the stats, it's like, well, actually their manufacturing output increased. It was actually just that, you know, a lot of these jobs simply disappeared through automation. And also in, like, I mean, it's not saying that obviously that outsourcing did happen. So, and China did become the world's leading manufacturer, but in that period, China actually lost 16 million industrial jobs. So, I mean, we're talking about like the 80s to the 2000s here. Like, I think China started, you know, outsourcing to China started in like the 70s, but after a decade, it was like, well, yeah, there was still, you know, their production of goods was still increasing, but they weren't generating new jobs because these were being automated and people were being replaced by robots. So Bastani kind of explains this by talking about the way that capitalism solves problems. And this problem is obviously, well, for capital, the problem is labor, or like the fact that it exists in tension to labor and labor's demands of increasing wages and, you know, improving conditions. And so, so in the first sort of wave of outsourcing of manufacturing from the West to like East Asia primarily, that was kind of what he calls like a spatial fix. And so you had this sort of post-war period of sort of growth and prosperity in countries like Australia and the UK and the US, the post-World War II period in which there was this sort of, you know, economic growth, increasing equality, economic equality, sort of stable income rises, and sort of this, you know, which you saw reflected in like rising home ownership, etc., and sort of strengthening a very strong sort of union movement that was increasingly demanding more and more and better wages. And so, you know, the solution, quote unquote, for capital was to simply ship that offshore to places where workers were less organized or were cheaper to hire. And so now the problem isn't so much, now the fix isn't so much spatial, it's not so much about relocating production, it's about increasing profits by replacing people with machines. And so, yeah, this is potentially like a pretty serious problem for countries that were maybe banking on being the next beneficiaries of like a wave of investment in manufacturing after wages in China rose to the point where capitalists were like, okay, let's stop making stuff in China, let's start making it in like Nigeria or whatever, you know, the Philippines. If they're like, okay, well, it's actually just cheaper to replace the people with machines in wherever the factory is already located, and then we don't have to worry about, or we increasingly don't have to worry about wages at all. So that's kind of what he means about like the spatial fix and the technological fix. And I've got heaps more quotes, blah, blah, blah. So what he kind of argues is that what's happening in manufacturing today is something that happened in agriculture over the, I guess it was like 18th, 19th century, but also 20th century with like the Green Revolution, which was this like massive increase in labor efficiency, which was the ability to feed more people, more food than ever, with ever few people doing the work. And there's some good stats you have here that I think are quite instructive. So like even as recently as like, you know, the 1800s, in most of Europe, like 60 to 80% of the population worked in agriculture. And that was true in like the Roman Empire of like the 1st century AD, or like Eastern China under the Song dynasty 1,000 years ago. Like, you know, 60 to 80% of people, sometimes more, just worked in agriculture, most often as sort of like serfs, cultivating land that they didn't own. And in those, you know, in that century, or those 2 centuries, you just got this amazing explosion of labor efficiency in agriculture. And now, you know, in Europe, it's like 3% or 4% of people work in agriculture. I think it might even be less in Australia, 2 or 3% of people work in agriculture. And it's not so much, it's not even just that, like, you know, you intuitively like, oh, well, maybe it's just because that was, you know, outsourced, you know, to other countries. It's labor efficiency. So 1% of people in the United States work in agriculture in the US, but the US leads the world in the production of milk, corn, chicken, and beef. So it's just this amazing exponential growth in labor efficiency. And so he thinks that's what's happening in manufacturing, but also not just manufacturing, like all across the economy. So he writes that the default presumption among economists, at least until recently, was that just as many people's work shifted from agriculture to industry, something similar would unfold with services. Post-industrial service-based economies would replace those built on manufacturing. And to some extent, this was borne out. Even China's service sector grew relative to manufacturing while it became the world's leading industrial power. In countries like France, Britain, and the United States, services now comprise 80% of both economic output and jobs. But there's only one problem with the presumption that services, high or low skilled, will provide jobs where industry and agriculture no longer will. It turns out that any repetitive endeavor, whatever the industry, can be automated within this new rising digital economy. And so then he goes on to other sectors of the economy. First is transport and logistics. So, 2014 driving was 4 million jobs in the US, and according to a report by Goldman Sachs, he likes to quote a lot of like, big sort of financial institutions and orthodox economic financial institutions to show that these ideas aren't just, you know, him being a fringe leftist thinking this. This is what, you know, the big titans of, you know, economic projection are saying. So according to a report by Goldman Sachs, the country could see job losses at a rate of 300,000 a year as autonomous vehicles are brought in. So obviously that's like massive savings to companies, logistics companies. They don't have to pay drivers. And he's talking about retail. Then he goes into retail. He's talking about like Amazon apparently have some shop in Seattle where they use computer vision, deep learning algorithms, and sensor fusion to identify selected items that the company look. Oh, so they just have this store with no cashiers. You just walk in, you swipe your phone, you get the things you want, and you just walk out, and it's automatically debited to your Amazon account. That's like,
there.
sorry?
I've,
You've been?
I've been to that store in Seattle.
What was it like?
It's really, it feels like fake. It feels like it doesn't feel like a real store, but it also feels like the future. You're there and you're like, oh, this is a lot easier, and I don't know why the entire world won't eventually become like this. But it felt like I was in the future. It was frightening.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how do they stop, like, what's their, like, how do they prevent shoplifting in stores like that? Is there a security guard? Or?
Basically, you can't go in unless you've got the app on your phone and activated. You're not allowed in. And as soon as you, and the app is like connected to your credit card. So as soon as you like walk out with something, the app knows, and it goes immediately on your credit card.
Yeah.
It's wild. I don't even know how it's possible. I don't even know how it was possible, but I didn't buy anything. I left quickly. I was afraid.
Yeah, I wonder like what happens if like the server just goes down for a second. You can possibly get away with walking out with hundreds of dollars of books, whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, like that's obviously, you know, probably a sort of an extreme example of like a company that's, you know, innovating with something radically different. But obviously, I mean, if most of the people in this chat are around the same age as me, are like, you know, in their like early 30s or 20s, like, you know, we all grew up before what is it called? Automatic registers at supermarkets. And in our lifetime, we've seen, you know, all of the big supermarkets introduce automatic registers. Is that what they're called? Automatic registers? You know what I'm talking about? Like Coles and Woolworths, where, you know, there's no cashier, you just do it yourself. Anyway, I guess, yeah. And so the increasing automation of retail is potentially going to have a massive impact on the economy, because salesperson and cashier are basically the two biggest jobs in the United States. And probably, I'm sure, I would imagine it's somewhat similar in Australia. Yeah. So I've got more stats, more scary stats about automation in retail that I could just throw at you, but we can come back to that later. Essentially, I think it's pretty solid, the idea that there's going to be increasing automation in retail. Obviously, I don't know. Yeah, maybe people will disagree. Obviously, some people, you know, want some sort of personal connection when they visit stores. Maybe it would depend which kind of store you go to. You know, like little mum and pop corner stores, you know, might not automate because partly their value then becomes the personal connection, but big impersonal stores like Bunnings or you know, IKEA or Woolworths that weren't offering a personal service to begin with. It's like they've got nothing to lose by automating. Anyway, so that's retail. Then he goes into medical. He's talking about new sort of medical devices, talking about automation in like analyzing x-rays and CT scans. And it's like, so basically radiology, field of radiology could be basically like 90% automated, etc. I'm just skipping lots of these notes because I don't need to like bore you with the details, but that's medical. Also law and legal services, which is I'll do law and legal because Rachel is here. So he says that there's potentially going to be like quite a lot of automation in law and legal services. And he quotes this 2016 study by Deloitte, which says that 114,000 legal jobs in Britain, which is about 40% of the entire sector, could be automated over the next 20 years. But also the technology has already eliminated 31,000 jobs in the industry. So those are like lower level positions, which I guess like junior lawyers and paralegals being replaced by like intelligent search systems. So people that have kind of the most low level repetitive jobs that are just about processing information that they then pass on to like more senior solicitors, like those kind of things might just be automated. Yeah, so that's interesting. What do you think, Rachel? Is that scary?
Yeah, like I've heard this before, and a lot of lawyers are like, there's no way they can automate our job. It's, you know, it's too complicated. But I think the whole automation thing, like, I mean, it is, I feel like it, you know, like they're usually talking about low paid, like, you know, unskilled labor. But yeah, I guess like the critique of automation is like that there's, you know, what seems like a natural progression is really, you know, there's choices behind it. And I think it's, you know, I think you can automate stuff like, you know, legal documents probably, but it's just because those jobs are seen as more valuable, or, you know, that's why that hasn't happened as much. And, you know, and what about like, you know, I feel like in a lot of big organizations and corporations, you have a lot of really highly paid people who are like, I don't know, it's really unclear what they do. And like, I feel like automating those kind of managerial jobs, like, you know, I don't know if I've just gone on a big tangent and I missed some of what you were saying before, but you know, I feel like things like scheduling or organizing people or like human resources could probably be automated, but for some reason, well, you know, because like capitalism and it's those lower paid, you know, precarious work jobs that have been automated. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
I have a question. I think the way that I think about automation is starting to really shift because of the fact that, you know, our existence, I mean, I'm in Poland and you're in Australia, and you know what, you know, you were in lockdown for however many months, where it just felt like existence became, you know, somewhat automated. And I know that you're out of lockdown and things have eased there, but you know, I still feel like everything I do, I work with people I've never met in person now. And so I'm really curious about how automation, or the way that we think about automation, is going to shift once we have the option to gather again. But you know, whether, you know, how much we'll choose to, or how much we'll choose to actually try to move towards automation for, you know, reasons of economies.
Well, you can see the economic argument for automation in a world in which these kind of like epidemics become an increasingly regular feature of our lives. You know, if you're the owner of a business, like, okay, I employ, you know, 20 people in a space, in an enclosed space. And so every time there is another, you know, government enforced economic shutdown because of this epidemic. We have to shut down because we have all these employees in this place, and it becomes a basically like an incubation vat of disease. But if you could automate all those jobs, you could basically stay open during the pandemic, right?
Yeah, and the companies that have moved towards automation are already doing okay. I don't know which, but they're doing okay.
Even in Melbourne now, when you go to a cafe, the first thing you do is like scan your QR code, like to put down your details. So like because of COVID now, like, and then when you order, instead, I mean, they're all kind of different, but a lot of them, like instead of like a waiter coming to the table and taking your order, they kind of just give you the menu and give you water for the table, and then you kind of look at the like it's become a lot more automated, almost like overnight, just with COVID restrictions. And even though we're like opened up now, there's all these things in place to keep track of who was at the restaurant, which days, and it does feel a little bit like we're living in the future or something.
There's a lot of also, I know UPS is spending a lot of time working on drone technology.
Right.
And package deliveries through drone technology. And I think they're trying to move to, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
So they're going hardcore into automation. And there's a lot of companies like Tesla and NIO in China, car companies, electric vehicle companies, who are like on this race for self-driving cars. And it's going to be in like the next 5 years or less, where cars are going to be fully automated. We're not going to have to necessarily drive them ourselves if we don't want to.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the point. It's like you were saying, Rachel, yeah, it is a choice, but if governments allow it to happen, businesses will automate if it means production is cheaper, right?
Yeah, but then it's like, why is the focus on automating? I don't know, maybe this is just me talking off the top of my head, but without knowing much about technology. But sometimes I just feel like there are highly paid jobs that could be automated. But
and that would then save more money because you're automating a highly paid person.
Yeah, I mean, without yeah, I'm just kind of like thinking aloud. But jobs like, I mean, which we already to an extent, like using Excel and using sort of other kind of technologies that but I don't know, I just feel like sometimes I've worked in organizations where you have this very highly paid person doing just like, what do they do? Like they don't, and yeah.
Well, I guess one of the questions is, was that person doing a repetitive task that could be broken down into a series of like discrete individual tasks? Because that's kind of the basis of automating something. You're like, okay, this person does this job, which is comprised of these 10 components, which is then comprised of these 100 little processes. Or were those people more employed in like less repetitive kind of decision-making tasks?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a bit of both, but I mean, I used to work with this one woman who's, we were, like a, so this is working for a union, and she was like the membership officer, and her job was just adding members to the database, like when they joined, putting them in the right committees, like flagging, like, and then taking them off. And it was like a full-time job. And I was always like, how does this person still, you know, and you don't want to like say, you know, I'm not saying that she should have lost her job, but like there, you know, and I guess maybe that's one of those jobs that kind of used to be needed before computers and Excel and, you know, but yeah. Anyway, that's just, yeah. I don't know.
I mean, that job sounds highly automatable. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess what he's describing is like a general tendency, but obviously there's going to be people who, like, I don't know, are valued in their organizations for whatever personal reasons that will keep their jobs. This is just like,
but also, you know, I have worked in other jobs where like you've got someone who's very high paid, but you're always, you know, it seems like the people below them are actually like the ones doing all the work, and they're the ones who are supposed to be like making decisions. But I mean, couldn't you just get, if you got like an AI or someone to make those decisions, they might be better at it. And, you know, like, yeah.
I mean, yeah, like possibly better and possibly worse or terrible. Like, I mean, the whole robo debt thing, which I guess people who aren't Australian won't know what this is, but basically our government automated this debt collection service that aimed to, you know, discover people who owed, who had, what was it, like incorrectly claimed welfare or something. And then it like automatically put them on this list of debt collectors. But yeah, the algorithm was fucking stupid and it didn't work. Like it was wrong. It like falsely identified people that didn't owe money or hadn't, like, you know, cheated the welfare system. And then it just, there was like, it's dragged on for years, right? This like, like court case of people trying to be fighting the government, and they just settled it. Was it last week or this week? Yeah. Like that's an example of this automation going totally wrong and leading to horrible outcomes.
Yeah. That's the thing, like, you know, that stuff shouldn't be automated, I think.
No. When obviously it was automated partly for like ideological reasons, because I don't think, you know, I think the Liberal Party has like an institutionalized lack of care about welfare recipients. And so they were like, this might not work, but we don't care. We'll just, I guess they're regretting it now because they did implement it as like a supposed like budgetary measure to save money. Now they've ended up spending more money fighting this like, you know, years-long class action lawsuit that has cost them more money than they intended to save on like this whole scheme. So it's pretty, I can imagine like horrible dystopian scenarios of what might happen if like a union like yours tried to automate, you know, the decision of like what you would like fight for the new award wage to be. It's like, well, based on our previous 500 award wage negotiations, the optimal rate of the new that we should be fighting for at the Fair Work Commission is X. Like, you know, and it might just be totally silly because it ignores all these factors that someone like you would have a better awareness of. But yeah, there's, you know, that's the, you know, his account of automation is a very, very ambitious one. But, and I'm not 100% behind it, especially in like, the legal field.
I think there's probably other people in this conversation that know more about automation as well and have more insights. I feel like I don't really know what I'm talking about, but
yeah. Does anyone else? I mean, no, that was good. I'm not agreeing, but like, does anyone else have anything they want to share? Did you Peter? Did you want to just share the story that you just post it in the chat? Or don't want to put you on the spot.
I can't find the story. I'm trying to find it around. I have it in my room somewhere. It's really funny. I mean, if you think about the history of the Soviet Union, where they, you know, it kind of like crumbles because they end up with this massive bureaucratic apparatus. In this science fiction story, these cyberneticians automate their manager inside a computer, but they also prove that they give the computer manager the goal of furthering his own career or something. Instead, and basically it exactly replicates what the manager does.
I really want to read that story now.
It's a funny story because somebody was talking about sort of automating managerial functions before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know too much about automation either. I think that in my job, you know, you could easily automate most of the things I do at the library and have a fully automatic library. They actually have one in one of the Scandinavian countries, opened up basically an automated library service or something. But, you know, it would cost a lot of money to buy the equipment to do it. So there'd be a massive initial cost. And also I feel like, you know, a lot of the work that we do is like busy work anyway. Like you see this, like, especially now with COVID, it's interesting because like, you've just got a bunch of people doing work for Victoria, all this stuff. Like about half the labor everyone is doing is kind of like just so everyone can be at work and do a job or whatever. You know what I mean? Theoretically, you could basically automate about half of our work or something, and we wouldn't even do it. But then you have the problem that nobody had wages to spend in the economy. So at the moment, I think my point with that is that at the moment, it almost seems like there is a lot of busy work in the economy. There is a lot of people doing almost unnecessary stuff, and there's even a book about that. But they just give people jobs, like, because it's like it makes the economy go around. They could easily just keep doing that, or I don't really know what's better. Is full employment where we're all doing unnecessary things better, or would fully automated luxury communism be better? And we all just like abandon the pretense of like doing busy work. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, that's like a big debate, I guess, amongst these people is like, you know, universal basic services or universal basic income or like a job guarantee, which I guess all three of those, or mainly a UBI or a job guarantee, can be seen as ways of like guaranteeing wages and therefore consumer spending in a situation in which there is increasing automation of jobs. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, but like Bastani is like, yeah, no, just like fuck, no, who wants to be a cashier? Who wants to be a retail worker? Like, you know, the left should reorient itself towards like automating as much of these shit jobs as possible, and at the same time reorienting the welfare state to provide basic, like, you know, guaranteed housing, guaranteed was it housing, medical. I don't think he mentions food. There's been some debate about whether that should be part of it. But then, so like, you do have this like incredibly strong social safety net that means that like people who are automated out of work don't suffer declining living standards. But yeah, that's just UBS, and that's actually about decommodifying parts of the economy like housing. But yeah, in terms of like wages and consumer spending, that would be more, you know, things like a universal basic income or a job guarantee.
I think that's great. I actually agree with Bastani on it. I think that, you know, It would be great, but you would have to start off with like a 4-day week or something, and then a 3-day week or something, and increasing services and whatnot. I basically agree with him. I actually think the unions, haven't clocked on, in this. Obviously, casualization is kind of bad, and part-time work is kind of bad. I'm stuck in a part-time work. I would love more hours, and apparently there's many, many, many more people in the economy like this. They would just love more hours. But because they need the income, there isn't actually necessarily the need for the labor. But also there's an element where like I'm kind of happy working like 3 days a week or something, you know what I mean? 3-4 days a week feels about right or something, 4 days a week maybe. I think what I'm getting at is that like with a lot of people don't necessarily mind the part-time casual life, but they still want and probably deserve housing and services and a livable wage. So, but at the moment they don't have those things.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like when you read about labor history and the idea that the 5-day work week was just like a temporary stop in a trajectory of like an increasingly shrinking work week. I don't know, like maybe I didn't know anything about that until maybe like a couple of years ago when I started reading about it. And yeah, like, I don't know, I think it was like American unions, during the Great Depression and in that sort of like interwar period were just like fighting hard for a 4-day work week, based on the same principles that Bastani is saying is like, well, yeah, you can just get increased productivity through replacing people with machines. Like, we don't want to work. Why are we working 5 days a week, And it was, this general idea that the work week would just continue to shrink. I think like John Maynard Keynes, who I don't know if people know, is like one of the, he basically invented modern political economic theory. He in 1930s, he wrote this book called like The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren. And it's just like, it just presumed that, there would be this ever declining work week of like, from that point on of, 4 days to 3 days. But it's just become, for a variety of reasons, it's just become stalled since then at 5 days.
It's also really, it also obscures the amount of unpaid labor in society done mostly by women who are doing like the care work as well, because that's, having like, this focus on full-time work, when someone working full-time isn't actually able to care for children or for the elderly, and that falls on people that are working part-time or casual, but then are low paid and have like face precarious work. So there's that gendered element as well. Thanks, Peter. The clap.
Yeah, no, I've heard. I'm pretty sure in this book, they explicitly say that, like, because Bastani's more into universal basic services, but this book's more about argues more for like a UBI, and one of their arguments is like, essentially, I can send you a link to the book later. One of their arguments is like, we do have all this like, very important care work that isn't part of the paid economy. And a universal basic income would, to some degree, make sure that people doing that work are at least paid something. I'm not sure if that addresses like the larger structural issues of like an economy in which that work just isn't, fundamentally brought into the economic system of calculation. But that's one of their arguments. They're like, this unpaid care work, that's one way to make sure people doing that work can get paid. it's pretty interesting. I read about some like one of the countries that have done like a UBI studies recently, and there was just like sort of massive increase in divorces, and you know, all the conservative media people were like, this is why the UBI is absolutely, it's immoral and it's devilish communism. But it was like, you know, if you just think about it, it's like, no, suddenly you had all these like women who were like previously like economically reliant on abusive husbands, suddenly had like financial freedom. And then they were just like, right, I'm getting a divorce. Now I have money. So yeah, I think there's like a feminist argument for a UBI for sure. I'm not sure. Yeah. I guess maybe the same argument for a UBS could be something like, you know, having free government provided childcare, for example. Yeah. Does anyone, yeah, like I don't really know a lot about this stuff. I just read about it every now and again. Does anyone have anything to say, anything to ask?
I think, yeah, go on. I think one thing I would just like ask that, you know, it doesn't, the ownership of the technologies is a problem, because at the moment you have all of the scientific labor sucked up by Facebook and you know, not all of the scientific labor, you know, but a lot of like engineering and technical labor is sucked up by big corporations because they have the most capital, and a lot of the technologies are owned by big multinational corporations, which again, you know, if you were to say automate a library or something, it would be a sort of massive, expensive technological system, which you would then have to pay a sort of subscription to or something to some corporation. You'd have to have some sort of public ownership of the technologies, or you'd have to have some kind of like, you know, low tech sort of version out of Raspberry Pis and, you know, in the sort of Paul Mason-esque post-capitalist vision of, you know, sort of Wikipedia post-capitalism or something, with, I don't know, 3D printers and backyard farming or something like this, you know, where you've kind of automated, you know, where you can own the technologies, I guess is what I'm saying, like of automation. I guess what I'm saying is you have to tackle the ownership and control of the technologies. It doesn't like, it's not like you could just have fully luxury automated communism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I mean, that's his argument. His argument is like, yeah, all these technologies are essentially like straining at the boundaries of capitalism, and you do need to like have a sort of like, you know, social restructuring of all these things if you want to take these technologies to their potential. I mean, it's kind of, yeah, like what you're describing about like, you know, automating a library or whatever is kind of what Google already tried to do, right? I mean, if you look at Google Books, like, you know, when you like search for a quote or something and you like, you go to like the Google Books entry for it and it's just like this weird abridged version of the book with all these pages missing. Like that is the vestigial remnants of a project that Google tried to do, I don't know, like a decade ago, where they basically were like, right, we're digitizing every book in the world and we're going to have, you know, basically create some sort of service where it's like you can access every book in the world via this service. And then, yeah, they just ran into like all these proprietary difficulties with negotiating with publishers, and the whole thing collapsed. There's a really good documentary about it. It's called Google and the world brain. And yeah, and so like they were already like pretty far along with this project, which is why there's like so many books on Google Books. Like, you know, you can access all these things. Yeah, but it's just, yeah, because of the existing like legal infrastructure around intellectual property. It was like, well, this just can't accommodate this thing that Google is trying to do. And I'm not saying that like Google is obviously not like, you know, motivated by some sort of pure altruistic desire to set information free. I guess like eventually they did want to like incorporate that into their business model. But yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, you should, that was, yeah, Google basically tried to do this. And
it highlights something you see it's a lot today, which is that's like a degree of like scarcity is kind of artificially maintained. You know, obviously it would have been terrible for publishers and potentially for writers, insofar as you don't have fully automated luxury communism or universal basic services. For these people to suddenly lose their income would have been awful. So a degree of scarcity is artificially maintained. Hypothetically, though, you could just have this global brain. You could have Google Books. And then the interesting thing, of course, is that they crop up anyway, you know, in the form of LibGen or you know, these pirate libraries run from Eastern Europe and whatnot. You see these, you know, that are sort of not, you know, obviously not as good as Google Books because they don't have this sort of infrastructure and scientific labor or whatnot to make it. But they're basically a very similar thing. And I see it with the housemates and stuff as well. Like, I don't know what they are, but they seem to have programs on their computer that give them access magically to like every single streaming service or something at the click of a button, like for free or something. You know, it's probably some kind of malware that's like hacking them in other ways or something. I don't know, but the potential is obviously there for some sort of post-scarcity, but the scarcity is kind of like imposed on it anyway. So you have this kind of tension where post-scarcity is always kind of like about to break out or something. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it's like, how many, you know, because of that, of just how, well, in their terms, zero marginal cost, that kind of, you know, a PDF is, it's like, I think I don't go to uni anymore, but my login still works, but I don't even bother using that to access books. I just go to LibGen, you know, to access ebooks, because it's just like, okay, click once onto this thing. You don't have to enter any password details. You download the book. Yeah. And I think, yeah, it annoys me that there's like all these great books that I want to read, but like there's only like, you know, you go on Trove and there's only 2 copies in the whole of Australia of the physical book. It's like, I wish there was like a service that had digitized all those books, and yeah, I'd pay, like I would pay a subscription. But you know, yeah, there's definitely like a lot of potential economic problems with that. Like it's about how to pay authors, and obviously Spotify is an example of how that can get really fucked up, because like, you know, I don't know, I have like music on Spotify, and like, I don't know, we've got like thousands of streams, but I've probably made like $3 from that, you know. And it's like, okay, so if you have this good that can just be like streamed multiple times, and you want to set up a payment service that is like you get paid per stream, or if it was books, it would be like pay per read. It does potentially, like, you know, people can exploit that, because you can just, if I was getting paid like $1 per stream, I'd probably just be sitting here like refreshing my Spotify from another account, just like giving myself fake money, fake streams to get myself paid. And so Spotify's answer to that, I guess, is just to make it the payment for one stream so low that there's no benefit in doing that. I don't really know anything about Spotify. That's my like theory in my head about why Spotify's payment is so low. But yeah, if they were to do something like that with books, it would be the same problem. Like if, you know, how to, you know, if you want to totally digitize access to books, and you want to create a business model, a business model inside a capitalist system in which the writers of those books are being paid for like the intense amount of work they do to create those books. Yeah, that is definitely, you know, the Spotify business model isn't necessarily going to work for that. Michael has said in the chat, Josh might have some insight about Spotify. Is Josh still here? I don't see Josh, but he's here. Oh, he's here, and he's leaving us hanging. I'm chilling, not thinking. Yeah, no pressure. Yeah. So, does anyone have any other questions? So yeah, if you don't, that's cool, because I have like, we're still only on part 1 of the book. We can talk about post-scarcity energy and asteroid mining and some other stuff. I've got some very interesting stuff. I did promise to like relate this to Jewish theology at some point, which I try half-assedly to do at some point later. So does anyone have any questions? And if not, maybe I'll jump forward. Okay, cool. So that's automation. That's just part 1. That's just part 1 of, it's like section 1 of part 1 of the book. The second section of part 1 is post-scarcity and energy. And okay, so let's do some stats. So right now, the total population of the world consumes about 17 to 18 terawatts of energy every hour. So that's about 150,000 terawatt hours per year. So that means that the average person is using about 2 kilowatts of constant energy, which is about the same as having a kettle switched on all the time. Although over the next 3 decades, these figures are going to substantially increase. That's because the population is rising, but also because increasing electrification and sort of electricity consumption and in countries of the global south, which means that those countries are going to consume more energy for like heating, transport, appliances and stuff. Yeah, so he estimates that most likely about, you know, in about 2040, the world's population has hit 9 billion. It's potentially going to be using about twice as much energy as we do now, which is obviously a problem, massive problem in a situation right now where we're trying to like rapidly decarbonize the world energy system, because we have all these really, really scary looming sort of timelines of decarbonization to make sure we don't overshoot our carbon budgets and hit, you know, 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, and potentially, you know, a sort of multiplying effect of climate feedback loops that basically throw us into some fucking horrible climate change dystopia. Anyway, so, you know, the general response would be, okay, so it's going to help if we like reduce our energy usage, but potentially that's just not going to happen. And his assumption is that that's not going to happen but also that it doesn't need to happen. So he's like, okay, we should just, no, we need to like technologically push towards a situation where it doesn't matter how much energy we use, we have, you know, super advanced solar technology. That means we're capturing so much energy from the sun that it's like we've got more solar energy than we know what to do with. So this is because about 80% of the world lives in places where there's enough sunlight to rely exclusively on solar. But also because of just the abundance, the amount of energy that the sun is sort of beaming onto the earth. And so it's got some good stats here. Like the amount of solar energy constantly hitting the Earth's atmosphere is about 174 petawatts. Of this, approximately half hits the planet's surface. Humans currently consume less than 20 constant terawatts a year, meaning that thousands of times more energy furnishes our planet than we currently require. So indeed, the energy of the sun is so immense that despite being millions of miles away, in just 90 minutes, the Earth is hit with the equivalent energy all of humanity uses in an entire year. So, I mean, that's pretty impressive, but obviously right now, I think solar panels are about 30% efficiency. So even though they're potentially getting as much, you know, the Earth is receiving as much solar energy in 90 minutes, you know, as the world's population of humans use in an entire year. It's about increasing solar efficiency dramatically so we can capture and store that energy. So we've had solar for ages, but until recently it remains sort of uneconomical and inconvenient compared to fossil fuels. But he argues that, especially in the last 2 decades, this has really changed. So solar costs have just plummeted in the last 2 decades. So it's got some good stats here. Solar capacity has doubled every 2 years, but it also increased by a factor of 100. I know that's about capacity, but anyway, yeah, the efficiency of solar has increased and the costs have just plummeted. I could throw some stats at you, but let's not worry too much about that. So it's also about storage, but also the cost of lithium storage is decreasing greatly. And so he thinks that increasing solar efficiency combined with rare earth minerals used, sourced from asteroid mining, which we can get to in a bit, quote, will spell an end to energy scarcity altogether, as a new technology energy matrix of ever smarter machines combined with ever cheaper and cleaner energy will make resource extraction beyond our world possible, yielding extreme supply and raw materials. This completes a chain that permits humanity to entirely exceed our present limits. So, does anyone have any thoughts about this? Does this seem hopelessly naive and optimistic and totally the wrong approach to take as we face potential climate catastrophe? Or does this seem intuitively to be, you know, a compelling proposal? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Is he saying we're going to have way too much energy, heaps more energy than we need?
Yeah, so we already receive way more energy than we need. Like he said, the Earth receives enough solar energy in 90 minutes to power the world for a year. It's about creating photovoltaic cells that are efficient enough to capture that energy, and storage devices that are efficient enough to store it. And he thinks that if the efficiency of solar keeps rising, that essentially we can do that. And so he thinks rather than trying to limit energy usage, we should just not worry about how much energy we consume and just try to focus on efficiency of the tech. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm not an expert. There's like, you know, you can look at charts of like photovoltaic system efficiency over the last 3 decades, and it is like a sort of gradually increasing slope, but it's still only at like, it's below 30%. So 30%, so over 70% of the sunlight that hits a solar panel is not captured. And so, I don't know. This is a technical question, so it's maybe not, it's not like particularly interesting to you, but yeah, it does kind of require, I guess, a lot of technical knowledge to really explore and question. But like, yeah, it's like, well, okay, well, the efficiency of solar either has to like rapidly increase, so, or if we want to keep using as much energy as we do now, we just need to roll out just like incredible, huge amounts of land area need to be dedicated to solar, presuming we want to keep using as much energy as we want to use, because, yeah. Anyway, so there's tons and tons of critiques of this, and I can get into it, but maybe before we get into those critiques, I'll just sort of explain the other half of this equation, which is that obviously, like, yeah, the solar energy hitting the sun is infinite, but solar panels are made of a bunch of rare earth minerals, which, as the name implies, are rare. And so if you do want to like massively accelerate the rollout of solar, you need to massively accelerate the mining of rare earth minerals. And that's going to be difficult because they're rare, and mining them on Earth might come with all these costs, etc., etc. So his answer is asteroid mining, which is quite, you know, I guess it just sounds kind of like optimistic and like pretty. What will we do with the accursed share of extra sunlight? Oh my God. I started writing this thing about George Bataille. And then this George Bataille and climate change recently. I know. The solar anus, Peter. Anyway, so yeah, so his answer to the resource scarcity of minerals that are essential for renewables is asteroid mining. And so a bunch of these stuff like lithium, copper, nickel, and zinc, and phosphorus. Well, phosphorus isn't for renewables. That's mainly like an input for agriculture. But yeah, all of these things are potentially facing supply shortages in the next few decades, especially if we accelerate the rollout of renewables, which we kind of need to do. So his answer is asteroid mining. And he sort of, yeah, he has this whole section where he outlines this sort of fledgling asteroid mining industry that has kind of started over the last 2 decades, I guess. There's like Elon Musk with SpaceX, and there's a whole bunch of other companies that have started sort of prospecting asteroids to see what the possibilities might be for mining them. I believe there's a Japanese one. There's a Japanese, it's called Hayabusa 2. It's a Japanese asteroid sample. It landed on the asteroid in 2018 and started collecting samples, and I believe it's due back this year. Yeah, so there's actually this whole, like, you know, I guess it's called this kind of like space interstellar gold rush or minerals rush happening right now that I had no idea was happening until I read this book. And why is there so much interest in it? He uses this example of just one near-Earth asteroid, which is about, I think it's between Mars and Jupiter. It's called 16 Psyche. It consists of iron, nickel, and copper, and gold and platinum. And based on core samples extracted from it, they think its iron ore alone could be worth $10 quintillion. So that's 1 with 19 zeros after it, which is more than the entire combined economies of Earth. It's actually, I think it's like 10,000 times more than the size of the global economy in 2019. So that's how much minerals are on some of these asteroids. And so he calculates that if you scoop up if you combine all these other asteroids and their combined mineral wealth, and then divided it between every person on Earth, it would add up to more than 100 billion each. Yeah. So obviously, like, some of these calculations are, rough estimations, but it's pretty interesting. It's and he thinks it's inevitable. He thinks that whether or not we like it in the next few decades, asteroid mining is just going to start happening. Yeah. Do we have any space people that want to say that this is all bullshit, or ask any questions about it? No, I'll just keep talking. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. To prepare for this, I read all this a few things about this sort of like fledgling asteroid mining industry, and apparently it's I read this thing in the MIT Tech Review, and it said that the asteroid mining bubble has kind of burst recently. Like, a bunch of the companies have kind of collapsed, and partly this is because you'd think, okay, well, that kind of rains on your parade, Bastani, about the possibility of all this stuff, but it actually kind of confirms his point, like one of his points, which is so when he's talking about like space exploration and asteroid mining, he's like, essentially, this stuff isn't going to happen if we leave it to private investment. And if you look at like all of the most innovative, disruptive technologies of the last century, like the internet and space exploration, like NASA space exploration, like those were all sort of mission-oriented, state-funded projects. And like rockets, robotics, 3D printing, and all of this other stuff. Like these are all technologies that have essentially developed through the nurture of state investment, like not through private investment. Essentially, like state investment does the important R&D to get these products to a certain like feasible level, and then private investment, competes to lower the costs. But yeah, the point is that like, private enterprise isn't going to be able to like fund these things because often it's like profit window, is that the right term to put it? Like its timeline for profits are too short, which is basically what this article says. So all these asteroid mining companies got a whole bunch of like venture capital 10 years ago, which is what, and then Bastani wrote his book like, oh, this is like a great industry. This is this like amazing growing industry that's going to change the supply of mineral resources. But then it collapsed because essentially like the venture capital profit window is 10 years. And so all these venture capitalists who had invested all this money in asteroid mining were like, okay, it's been 10 years and we're not rich yet. Like you haven't, we're not seeing, even the beginnings of profit from these, this asteroid mining. So we're going to stop funding you, because that's just basically, the life cycle of venture capitalist funding is like a decade. And this kind of stuff is like multi-decade projects. So yeah, it's potentially going to happen if governments invest money in it. But if they don't, it might not happen. Or it might rely on the will of like driven egotists like Elon Musk. And yeah, there's already like this amazing, well, it's not amazing, it's kind of horrific, this horrific kind of sort of maneuvering to privatize space and to work out what the legal framework of exploiting like interplanetary mineral resources will be. And so, you know, if it's going to be like, okay, will it be like first come best dressed? Like if you're the first one to land on an asteroid and start mining, does that mean you have property rights over all the minerals in that asteroid? Or yeah. And so apparently this is all happening right now, and large companies are sort of negotiating with governments and trying to establish a legal framework that will serve the ends of profiteering off like mineral resources on asteroids. And yeah, Bastani's point is like we can't let capitalists design the legal infrastructure of space. And yeah, we need governments to basically step in and drive this investment, and we need to make sure that these mineral resources are shared, are basically like distributed equally amongst the people of the world. So yeah, I have to pee. So hold your thoughts if you have any thoughts. I might try to I'll play some music. Let's go to a music break, and then we can keep talking when I come back. So
Fully automated luxury kosher space kibbutz.
You think you can fuck with someone like us?
You what you mean, someone like us?
Techno-capitalist singularity as Judaic futurism vectored through neo-nomadic, globalized class formation leads to loopholes in the collapsing climate system. As self-deregulating markets crash into feedback loops of data, machinic intelligence emerges. In Vilna, 3023, the third Lubavitcher Renaissance begins. Microprocessor Talmudic analysis of Kabbalistic algorithms reveals the cyberotic potentialities of the from bedroom with an avatar of Menahem Mendel Schneerson broadcasts messianic promises from the LED screens of mitzvah tanks, which occupy Galicia in preparation for the re-uploading of the Baal Shem Tov. The Arachno-Bubby complex modernizes, upgrades guilt and drags you into the dark web. The Fourth Rabbinical Council of Scattered Dashes is lurching into crisis. Cloning, lateral genodata transfer and transversal replication have led to chronological disjunct in the weekly Parsha. The land of milk and honey goes full Mad Max as mechanized Israeli Defense Force or vertically expand Greater Israel through the Babel V2 program. Millennialist evangelicals and Likud-affiliated militias battle each other after the final breakdown of a superficial, temporary alliance under the banner of
Judeo-Christian values. Palestinians are eventually so dispossessed that they transcend carnal existence and hover as this carnal goes through the West Bank,
haunting the sickly blood of settlers.
Transhumanist biotech enables functional immortality, and the 350-year-old Sarah Silverman is on Saturday Night Live every night waving a Havdalah candle menacingly at the world. The Neo-Bud arrives from the future, offering revolution stripped of all Christian socialist eschatology and dreams packed with fluid time schemata. The end is coming. The end has come. The end would have come until its problematic elements are deconstructed on cool Jews. Scattered and desperate, neo-Bundist forces remix the Torah, have Xenodata to counteract racial essentialism, and
Crash your daughter's bat mitzvah for free, please.
Meltdown.
Planetary request cosmopolitan syndrome spreads.
As Gentiles adopt the Judaic hypertextual method, following
Things like a state the boy discovering red, dissolution of the biosphere and atmosphere,
and the collapse of both into the Thulusphere. Nomadic Sephardi rabbis expand the tentacles of scientific knowledge from 30th century Dubai into neo-feudal Europe. The fully automated luxury kosher space kibbutz is sucked into wormholes Zuckerberg 4382, leaving a trail of dust and the ephemeral
architecture of embryonic futures.
That was a remix of Hava Nagila mixed with a remixed version of Nick Land's Meltdown. Nick Land's early cyberpunk fiction Meltdown that I made a couple of months ago. Yeah. So, does anyone have any questions yet? Or anyone wants to talk about asteroid mining, or why they think it's stupid, or anything? Or should I get on to some of the reasons that I think some of this is stupid? No? Okay. Well, okay. I'm going to jump just to something that I've been thinking about when I was reading this book, which is just a sort of general, it's not just about asteroid mining, it's just like a general environmental critique of this whole thing. And it kind of comes back to the question of economic growth, and the fact that we are kind of going through this climate crisis at the moment. So like the underlying argument of this whole like fully automated luxury communism is that basically everyone in this proposed world can live like a wealthy American. Well, that's what Bastani says. Everyone can live like a wealthy American does right now. And obviously this implies continued economic growth. Of course, not necessarily capitalist, economic growth. So he would say that like essentially planned democratic communist economy is going to be more rational than capitalism and therefore has the capacity to grow infinitely. And so essentially this boils down to a sort of maxim that as long as infinite growth is rational, it's good. Or maybe to put it in other words, like, like revolutionary changes in the productive relations in which like labor has increasing power will result in technological advances that decrease scarcity and have non-linear consequences, allowing for decoupling to happen. I'll explain what that is in a sec. For decoupling to happen at the level of production, which is basically where most environmental and social exploitation happens. And so if you have like a democratically planned, technologically advanced socialist system, that will be sustainable in ways that like the same technology used under a capitalist system won't be. Yeah, so he doesn't really go into this in the book. It's kind of this like unspoken thing. People are making jokes about solar anus money. Okay. He doesn't really go into the concept of decoupling, but I think it's basically implicit in his argument. And so the idea of decoupling is that you can have material consumption of the world's resources and economic growth, like, that you can decouple those two things. So normally they just rise together, and I'll give some studies that basically show that that's basically what has always happened. But they think that you can basically have a growing economy without and restructure it in ways so despite the continual economic growth, you don't get continual consumption of resources. Or if you do, you can just outsource them to like, you can just start mine them from asteroids. But that's only some minerals. Obviously that's not everything. And so so I think the metric that most like environmental scientists use is this thing called DMC, domestic material consumption. It's like the total weight of all the raw materials, like biomass, minerals, metals, fossil fuels, everything that you extract as an input, plus all the physical imports minus physical exports. And so to work out like whether economies are decoupling, you take GDP as a measure of economic growth and DMC, domestic material consumption, and you look to see if they're diverging. And so ideally in this highly technologized society, what you're going to see is economic growth, wealth, i.e. continuing to rise. I need a graph. I'm just doing it with my hands. This is not going to work like this. Wealth continuing to rise and material consumption declining. I mean, that seems to be the implicit idea between all this idea of like zero marginal cost and highly efficient digital technology. Like, we're going to get all this amazing, this highly efficient production, but it's going to be using less and less of the world's resources. And to some extent, you see that, but what you see is relative decoupling, not absolute decoupling. That's one of the big problems here. And so relative decoupling means that it's like you can produce more things for less. So things are getting more efficient, but that's leading to like maybe cheaper prices, so people are buying more things. And so over time, material consumption continues to rise with GDP. And that's only in some goods. Like relative decoupling might only be happening in certain industries, not everything, not all levels of production. And often these like increases of efficiency, like they just lead to increased levels of consumption. So you can have, and so that means that you can have all these increasing levels of efficiency, but you still have increasing material and energy consumption. And so you have relative decoupling, but not absolute decoupling. And yeah, let me know if that doesn't make sense. I can try to explain it in other words. Yeah, so if you think about like music and software and movies and PDFs of textbook or something, you do see like this exponential curve of decoupling happening, where you do you have like a small fixed cost, and then you have just infinite zero marginal cost sharing of PDFs. But of course, all that's happening on like hardware, and so the hardware that we use to read PDFs, to listen to music, has that been relatively decoupled from material consumption and economic growth? I don't know. I don't think so. At least not to the degree that he would have you believe. So that, yeah, there was a good academic report that I read on this recently, which is by Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallis, called "Is Green Growth Possible in New Political Economy?" And they found that empirical evidence based on resource use and carbon emissions do not support the idea that you can have a decoupled green growth. And this isn't just like a fringe thing. This whole idea of having green growth is basically underpins, the UN ideas about what's going to happen to the economy over the next 100 years. The idea about creating sustainable economies is based on the idea that you can continue to have economic growth while decoupling that growth from like material consumption. And yeah, so they found that there's absolutely no empirical evidence that absolute decoupling from resource use can be achieved on a global scale if we have continued economic growth. And although you can have decoupling, you can have to a large degree absolute decoupling of economic growth and carbon emissions, which is probably the most urgent decoupling that we need to happen in the next decade or two. That decoupling isn't going to be happening fast enough to prevent global warming of above 2 degrees centigrade, based on the kind of growth projections that green growth advocates want. So yeah, does that make sense? Because it seems to me that if you're like someone like Bastani and you're promising this future of extreme abundance as a result of accelerated economic growth and not some kind of catastrophic climate breakdown, you really need to like wrestle with this notion of green growth and just growth in general, and whether this kind of decoupling is actually happening or is possible. And he doesn't really do that in his book. And that's, I think, one of like a massive, massive shortcoming of it. Yeah, I mean, he does in a sense, but in a way, it's like he does it as like more of like a political consideration than an environmental one. There's a part where he says, "A green politics of ecology without a red politics of shared wealth will fail to command popular support." And so he's basically saying like, well, we're not going to win popular support if we say to people, oh, actually, you need to like reduce your material consumption. That's going to be some kind of like ecological austerity, as this guy called Lee Phillips puts it. No one's going to be into that. We have to promise people abundance. And to do that, we need to reach decoupling. But he doesn't really wrestle with the difficult environmental, like the science that I've just spoken about how difficult or perhaps impossible that's going to be, especially on the timescales of preventing climate change. And yeah, it's really full on. Like, I think since like 1950, the global economy has expanded on average about like 3.5% a year. And if it's going to continue at the same rate, it's going to be about 200 times bigger in 2100 than it was in 1950. And if that happens, and everyone in the world achieves a level of affluence that is currently experienced by people in the West, that's going to mean economic output growing by like 30 times. And meeting, you know, carbon reduction targets in this world is just going to require an absolutely amazing amount of decoupling of economic growth from material consumption. And yeah, he doesn't really seem to wrestle with this stuff in the book. And that, I think, is a big shortcoming. And yeah, like there's some, yeah.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's just hard to imagine any argument against that. Any way you could rescue the project after that idea, after you debunk decoupling. Probably the only way that I've heard is, you know, there's, you know, the people talking about public luxury. Is that what the term is? Or the commons as a sphere of luxury. You know, obviously, if you take the idea that we can just make, you know, if you take private luxury, some idea that we can all live in mansions and have like green SUVs or something, then yeah, it's really not going to work, is it? Because you're just going to, it's a fantasy in which that would somehow use less resources and be less taxing on the planet, but it will always be taxing on the planet, and therefore taxing on some other people that, you know, that don't live in luxury or something, and as well as animals and whatnot, as the climate system breaks down. But perhaps you could have the notion of the sort of common luxury, you know, public forests and you know, public swimming pools and public sort of blah blah blah. You know, increase the or change the idea of luxury into something that is more like a sort of luxury of the commons or something. Maybe that would be a way to sort of have fully automated luxury, you know, communism. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of exactly the kind of like rhetoric that he uses in the book. Like he kind of like draws people in with these like great quotes, like, nah, infinity pools for all. But then he sort of like clarifies that actually what he means is, yeah, like you just have one infinity pool and you guarantee, well, like one infinity pool, like for 100 people, and you guarantee everyone free access to it. And, you know, yeah, luxury, like communal luxury in terms of something like public transportation, that's exactly what he means. He doesn't want to have a society where everyone is driving around individual, you know, electric Teslas. He wants to have like mass, you know, electrified public transit systems. Like, yeah, like, so he does use that rhetoric, but he just still doesn't really address this central question of like, does this mean economic growth? And if it means economic growth, for how long? You know, in some way, the whole asteroid mining thing is a way to get around the material limitations of like minerals on Earth, but that's not the only resource constraint that we face. So yeah, it just seems to be like a big gap in the book that leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And it's basically like the main critique of all this stuff that people from like the sort of degrowth camp make about this like left-wing eco-modernism. Yeah.
What's degrowth about?
Yeah, I should probably explain these things. Well, so degrowth is like the idea is premised on the acceptance of the fact that economic growth is inevitably going to be tied to material resource consumption. And so they say that the only way forward is to design a society where economic growth, the economy basically stops growing, and we reorient it towards degrowth, towards a shrinking economy. Yeah, I didn't really prepare a lot of notes about that, but it's still a fairly, like, from what I've read, it's still a fairly incoherent sort of political program. Like there's a real mix of, like, you know, scholars who critique eco-modernism and just sort of like, you know, local is beautiful, let's all go and live in Daylesford and, you know, hunt and like forage for mushrooms kind of people, like, who don't really necessarily have a good grasp of the intricacies of the global economy. But why did I say Daylesford? For people who don't live near Melbourne, Daylesford is like a little cute town near Melbourne where lots of people go to do organic farming. But I'm not shitting on Daylesford. Daylesford is cool. But yeah, so it's not really, I don't think, at least as far as I've read, there is this like kind of really coherent political program that you could say comes under the banner of degrowth. But yeah, there's been a bunch of books in the last 6 months that are on my like summer to read list. So maybe there is, and I just haven't read it yet. But yeah, essentially degrowth means designing an economy in which you have designing a shrinking economy, not a growing economy. Yeah. And so, yeah, like I said before, the main critique of these people like Bastani and other sort of leftist modernists are like, you can't sell that to the people. You can't sell the idea that we should fight for, you know, we should fight for the reversal of economic growth to a population. Like if you think about, you know, and I can kind of sympathize with it, if you think about the degree to which like GDP growth has become this like incredibly important metric that is used to decide how effective a government is, right? Like, you know, if the government of Australia, for example, you know, increases like, you know, annual GDP growth from its predecessor, they're going to be like, you know, spreading that far and wide as they can to be like, look, we're growing the economy, more jobs, you know, it's like GDP growth and is seen as this metric that then feeds down into like increasing prosperity and abundance, more jobs, more money circulating, more just general social well-being. It's, you know, and it's not like GDP is not a proxy, doesn't mean that, but it's come to be seen as a proxy of all those things. And so, yeah, degrowth, people who promote degrowth are confronting this like really, really ingrained like, you know, cultural attitude about the value of GDP growth as a proxy of social well-being that they have to try to reverse. Did that make sense? Who asked that? Rachel? Was that Rachel?
That's me, sorry. Yeah, I think so. I'm just kind of, yeah. I feel like they're, you know, I feel like people used to talk about some country that didn't rely on like GDP. I can't remember which one it was, but.
Oh, there is like a bit of
like this country that just looks at like the happiness ratio of its population and something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's like a Scandinavian country, right?
Yeah. Or it might, I think it was some weird.
Or is it New Zealand?
No. Let's see if I can find it.
it might be New Zealand added happiness or something as a metric, just from memory. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they did do something like that. Actually, yeah.
Mhm.
I think there was another one as well.
But yeah, like you said, Peter, it's like an added metric, right? They still use GDP. It's like GDP is still very central, right? They're just like, oh, let's also look at the surveys about how happy people are.
Yes, that's what I remember, but we'd have to check. Yeah. I mean, I read a lot of science fiction about this. I find it hard. I recognize that there's this academic paper that you've read about the decoupling being impossible. I find it hard. I mean, I still find it a little hard to believe somehow. But it makes me think maybe the answer is something like some kind of like high tech, some kind of bridge of like high tech, but with like the Dalesford mushroom fantasy or something. You know what I mean? Or some sort of like instead of the sort of leftist megatech, you have the sort of the Paul Mason-esque small to medium scale tech or something as a sort of goal. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone, but it would sort of imply, instead of having sort of mega tech and robots doing everything, that you aim for something something a bit more like you're still working, but you work like people work for Wikipedia or something voluntarily. You would be updating like 3D printing repositories so that you could like 3D print like little parts that you need for something or other, or it would kind of be like, or it would be like a sort of utopia of like in Switzerland or somewhere, and they have these, everyone has backyard farms or whatever. Like here's a vision, two different visions. One vision, you have massive scale vertical farms with publicly owned like robot arms going blah blah blah, and everyone's food is literally made by this total automated massive system or whatever, which you would have to hope that the public has some ownership and control over and isn't all run by some massive Monsanto tech or something. But another vision would be you have some kind of like blockchain, based exchange, and everybody grows things in their backyard or whatever, with or without the latest technology as they like. But then there's this sort of like automated exchange mechanisms where they're flying around with drones or something, like the people are growing one thing and delivering it to the other thing. So you have this kind of like small to medium scale tech or something. Like that could be two different visions. One is like a sort of Star Trek vision or something, and then the other one is kind of like there is a sort of science fiction book by Cory Doctorow, a few science fiction books by Cory Doctorow, who writes about this sort of a utopia of 3D printing and open source software, if you can imagine that sort of thing. So if you don't have clothes, you just kind of go to the sort of like wherever people built a 3D printery or something, and you build the thing there, and then you volunteer some labor or whatever, and then there'll be food there or something. It's kind of like the maker space logic, sort of like a utopia of sort of maker spaces as opposed to a sort of high-tech Star Trek thing. I wonder if that would be a way of achieving some sort of high-tech but smaller scale, more ecologically friendly future or something. I don't know. Or is that just a kind of fantasy outside politics, outside, the state?
Well, it depends, right? If like those maker spaces are leading to a situation of decreased consumption, like if degrowth is dependent on declining levels of consumption, like there's no reason that you can't have like a high tech degrowth if especially if like more and more tech is being developed by like governments and not developed by private companies who need to make profits. Like there's no reason you couldn't have high tech degrowth as far as I'm aware, but yeah, it's all about what is the overall ecological footprint of all those like small maker spaces, because you know sometimes these like smaller beautiful things that we hear, like, you know, like little organic markets in Dalesford that people might think are like the paragon of ecological sustainability, might not be. If it's like, okay, you have like, you know, 30 organic farmers on little farms, and they all drive their cars into this market 5 days, you know, a week to sell organic produce, and they all drive their cars back. You know, you have a decentralized distribution system, but that just means more people driving more cars, and maybe that would be less, that the ecological footprint would be smaller if that was more centralized, you know? Like, yeah, I think that any sort of like small scale thing, I'm totally for it, but it has to you know, like really seriously look at the total ecological footprint of all of these things. And yeah, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I think that like what you're talking about is something that I'm really interested in, is like the convergence of these two ideas of like futurist utopias, but also like it within a degrowth framework, or like using you know, what increasing technological efficiency as part of a degrowth framework. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe I can convince someone to let me like write a thesis about it at some point, so I can get some money.
Another answer to the sort of dilemma or paradox that you raised with sort of high tech, you know, never actually achieving decoupling, you know, and the sort of ecological gains that it would need, would be, you know, if you were an accelerationist or a sort of Bastani type, you would start to begin to talk about, maybe disingenuously, but you might start to begin to talk about geoengineering and, you know, you just more technology on top in order to solve whatever problem. For instance, you know, if you do overshoot the mark of energy production so much, you know, well, what could you do with that extra energy? You could suck carbon out of the atmosphere very, very cheaply. So potentially you could, you know, but again, it's maybe that's a kind of technological solutionism or something.
Yeah, well, that's another thing he doesn't talk about. Interesting.
Yeah.
Like a lot of these other leftist eco-modernist people, they kind of explicitly deal with the idea of geoengineering, which if people don't know, that means like kind of like engineering the Earth's climate based on the presumption that, okay, we're not gonna be able to decarbonize quick enough to stop global warming, so we need to employ like these like mass, you know, geological scale engineering technologies to stop or slow down or temporarily ameliorate the effects of global warming. And so like one of the main ones is it's like I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically you just like replicate what a volcano does to the international climate system, the global climate system, and you just pump a whole bunch of sulfur into the climate, and it basically acts as this kind of like I don't know, this sort of like atmospheric barrier that prevents like solar energy coming in, and it replicates what happens when there is when there's like a massive volcanic eruption and a bunch of sulfur is pumped into the atmosphere, and you do get these periods in the Earth's record of like a year or two of global cooling. Yeah, one of the most famous ones, just as a side note, is I think it was like the 1830s or 50s or something, when this volcano in, I think it's like the Indonesian archipelago, erupted, and it caused this like mass global cooling event that was global. And so it was felt in Europe with these massive like crop disturbances and this like incredibly cold summer. And is it Mary Shelley? Mary Shelley and her friends were like on vacation in Switzerland or something, and they were like, oh, we're gonna have this nice summer vacation, but then it was freezing and they had to stay inside. And they're like, oh, what are we gonna do? We're stuck inside. Oh, we'll write novels. And so Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. So the reason that this Frankenstein story exists is because a volcano erupted, caused global cooling, and led to Mary Shelley and her friends on holiday in Switzerland staying inside and writing horror stories as entertainment. But yeah, so geoengineering, basically there's a bunch of other methods, but it's about using sort of like engineering techniques to kind of try to alter the Earth's atmosphere to ameliorate global warming. And it's interesting in fully.
Is there any leftists who have gone in this direction that you know of? Like I can't think of any, but it would be interesting to know whether.
I can't remember one of the other really big left eco-modernist books is called Eco-Austerity by Lee Phillips. But I read it like a year or two ago and I can't remember if he goes into geoengineering. I don't know if you could call them leftists. So there's this thing called the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which was released, I think, in 2015 by a bunch of like environmentalists, and that goes hard on support for geoengineering. It's just like, yep, there's just no way we're going to decarbonize fast enough, whether you like it or not. We're going to need to do geoengineering, so let's embrace it. Let's celebrate human ingenuity, and let's get good at geoengineering. And so like some of the people in that, I guess you could argue some of the people who put their name to that manifesto, I guess, are like progressives. They're not like Marxists or anything, I don't think, but yeah, I think there are some sort of, I guess, like politically progressive people that are big on geoengineering. One of the most interesting ones is Stuart Brand. I don't know if you know who Stuart Brand is, but he wrote this book a few years ago called Whole Earth Discipline, which is basically, advocates for geoengineering, among other things. And so Stuart Brand, he was this sort of kind of like instrumental figure in this whole like Californian counterculture that kind of turned into like the early cybernetics movement. And I don't know if you've heard of the Whole Earth catalog. He was the guy who started this thing called the Whole Earth catalog in the early 70s, I guess. And it was like this kind of like utopian project where he tried to like, there was all these like hippie communes starting in the late 60s in the US. And he was like, we need to like provide this like amazing source. We need to provide this amazing like resource for these people to give them advice about like what tools to buy and what seeds to buy. And so I'm going to start this thing called like the Whole Earth catalog that's going to have like all this information, and I'm going to crowdsource reviews about different tools, and it's going to be this kind of like decentralized I guess media sort of apparatus. And then I think that was digitized like in the 80s. Like he was part of this whole like early like internet culture. And yeah, and so I guess in a way you could say he's a progressive. He's like one of those people that's like, oh yeah, kind of, I guess, progressive, but not in the like conventionally left-wing sense, but progressive in the sense of being this like talking about like, oh, creative disruption and innovation and like decentralization of knowledge and nodes and networks and all this whole, the whole like cybernetic thing. He wrote this book, which the title Whole Earth Discipline is obviously riffing off the Whole Earth catalog, which he wrote in the 70s. And he's just like, yeah, basically, humanity is becoming as gods, and we might as well get good at it. We might as well learn to engineer our climate to whatever we want. So he's like, yeah, to answer your question, he's like the most quote unquote progressive person that I can think who advocates for geoengineering. But I guess that depends on your definition of progressive or leftist. Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. You should, yeah, Whole Earth Discipline by Stuart Brand. I mean, in
I'm just trying to look it up. I can't find it in any local libraries, but maybe at the uni libraries or something. Yeah.
Oh, I've got an ebook. I'll send it to you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Come on, Peter. Zero marginal cost society. I'm pretty sure you can get it on like LibGen and stuff, but I'll send it to you anyway. What is it? Whole Earth Discipline. Yeah. Like it's not the most, I don't think it's the most like scientifically thorough book. It is like, you know, a typical like, you know, airport lounge polemic, you know. Okay, let's talk about paradigm shifts and disruption and this, you know, like it's pop science, but it's, I don't know. I think Stuart Brand is he's a pretty important person in that, in that sort of cybernetic movement. So it's definitely like, yeah, he has interesting ideas. Yeah. I need to piss again. So I might go to another music break. I feel like I'm on the radio. This is the closest I've ever got to talk back radio. We're just gonna go to a music break, and we'll be back. We'll be back shortly with more discussion of degrowth and eco-modernism. As soon as I figure out how to make Zoom work. Oh God, share screen. Screen 2, this screen. Okay. Now I'm gonna play the music. back. It's telling me that my speaker isn't working. Don't know why that is. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I can hear you. I guess this is the more important one, seeing as this thing is saying that my speaker isn't working. I guess it's just my computer being silly. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff in terms of like the tech side of this book, and that's like he talks about like gene editing technology and how that might potentially lead to the elimination of like genetic diseases like Huntington's or like cystic fibrosis. And there's like a whole section about vat grown food, etc. But I thought I thought it would be kind of interesting to also explore like some of the like I said, I was going to try to like go down a sort of theological road and talk about, I guess, the idea of utopia from a theological point of view. I guess these points aren't necessarily Jewish purely. I guess they're more like Abrahamic in general, but because we're talking about like radical, what might seem like really, really super ambitious utopias, it would be interesting to look at this like really long running sort of critique of the idea of utopia as a kind of secularized messianism. So I want to quote something from this section of fully automated luxury communism that is called "Fully Automated Luxury Communism is a Beginning, Not a Destination." And I'll explain why. This has got something to do with messianic religion, like the messianic idea in Abrahamic religions. And so Bastani writes, "The shifts outlined as central to the third disruption are not a destination, but a beginning. Fully automated luxury communism is not a blueprint for a steady state Eden. Those always prove disappointing anyway, nor is it a place beyond sadness or pain, where conflict and vulnerability are consigned to the past. Pride, greed, and envy will abide as long as we do. The management of discord between humans, the essence of politics, an inevitable feature of any society we share with one another. Instead, fully automated luxury communism is a figurehead of possibility forged for a world changing so rapidly that new utopias are needed, because the old ones no longer make sense." Isaac Deutscher once wrote, "Socialism is not evolution's last and perfect product, or the end of history, but in a sense only the beginning. This is how fully automated luxury communism is perhaps best conceived. It is a map by which we escape the labyrinth of scarcity and a society built on jobs. The platform from which we can begin to answer the most difficult question of all, of what it means, as John Maynard Keynes once put it, to live wisely, agreeably, and well." So I guess to sort of explain the link here, it's like, why is it that Bastani is so emphatic about in saying that this utopian proposal he has is not about the end of history or this final destination to human progress. Obviously, to some degree, it's because I don't know if you people know, but there's this very famous book I think it was like released in the early 90s or 89. Oh no, Francis Fukuyama wrote this book called The End of History, and he basically argued that, because the Cold War had ended, essentially, liberal, economically liberal capitalism, economically liberal democracy was going to be basically hegemonic forever, and we'd see the end of ideological contestation. Obviously, that didn't happen, and it's not happening. And so in a way, yeah, partly I think Bustani emphasizes that the idea of fully automated communism isn't about the end of history. That's partly because it's just like, okay, I don't want to end up like Fukuyama. But like it goes, the kind of claims that Fukuyama is making, it goes back way before that. And it's quite interesting because he's not like a radical, you know, Marxist, but he does draw on Marx and Hegel and this kind of like teleological strain in their works, which I'll explore in a bit. But so there's this really long tradition of dismissing radical utopias as a form of like secularized eschatology, which eschatology is like the theology of the end of the world, and the, you know, whether it's the return of the Messiah and the beginning of the Messianic period. And so all, you know, all three major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all, you know, have this sort of inbuilt structure in them about the return of the Messiah and the end of the world through violent cataclysm, or, you know, some, you know, terminal rupture in the progression of history. And so, like, in secular terms, like a messianic political program is one that strives for utopia and the advent of a new period that's kind of wholly unrecognizable from everything that has gone before it. This idea that this kind of like paradisical society is the necessary and inevitable end of history. Yeah. And I got some more quotes here, I'll just skip them. Anyway, so the idea that radical utopias are a kind of secularized form of messianic zeal is actually really common over the last 200 years. I'm going to quote some like right-wing people, but you'll see in a sec that this isn't just, you know, the right trying to disparage the left or anything. So this kind of like secular messianic label has been quite often applied to Marxism. And the first one I have here is this little quote from this very long essay by the sort of Austrian libertarian economist Murray Rothbard, who writes that he's writing about Marxism, and he says, in the same way as the return of the Messiah in Christian theology would put an end to history and establish a new heaven and a new earth, so the establishment of communism would put an end to human history. And just as for post-millennial Christians, man, led by God's prophets and saints, would establish a kingdom of God on earth. Blah, blah. So for Marx and other schools of communists, mankind, led by a vanguard of secular saints, would establish a secularized kingdom of heaven on earth. And there's another one. I've got some other quotes, more quotes. This one is from, I think, he's like an English professor of philosophy, John Gray, wrote this quite popular book a few years ago called Black Mass. And he says, it has often been noted that for its followers, communism had many of the functions of a religion. In fact, reflected in the title of a famous collection of essays by disillusioned ex-communists, The God That Failed, which was published not long after the start of the Cold War. At its height, 20th century communism replicated many of the features of the millenarian movements that rocked Europe in the late medieval times. Soviet communism was a modern millenarian movement. And so, through the vision of the future that animated many Nazis was in some ways more negative, was Nazism. So he's, he's kind of saying that communism and Nazism are both unified or comparable based on this kind of like messianic kind of frenzy, which is kind of what Hannah Arendt says. I'll read a quote from her in a bit. Millenarian means that's more specifically Christian. That means like it's like the idea that there is going to be a century-long messianic period, and that's the millennium. And so these movements are called millenarian movements or millennialism. So I'll just read this one quickly. So yeah, So this idea of like this leftist utopia is secularized messianism isn't just the legacy of the right trying to discredit the left. Here is, I can't read this word right. I've never paralipomena. It's like the end notes to Walter Benjamin's On the Concept of History, and he writes, in the idea of classless society, Marx secularized the idea of messianic time, and that was a good thing. It was only when the Social Democrats elevated this idea to an ideal that the trouble began. And then he goes into a long spiel, just shitting on Social Democrats. Anyway, Hannah Arendt, I said I'd mention Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt On the Origins of Totalitarianism says, Marx's hopeful predictions that the state would wither away and a classless society emerge were no longer radical and no longer messianic enough. If Bardyaev is right in stating that Russian revolutionaries had always been totalitarian, then the attraction which Soviet Russia exerted almost equally on Nazi and communist intellectual fellow travelers lay precisely in the fact that in Russia the revolution was a religion and a philosophy, not merely a conflict concerned with the social and political side of life. So, does that make sense? Does anyone have any comments about this whole idea of radical left-wing movements as secularized messianic fervor? Because I can keep ranting, but
is your implication that fully automated luxury communism is in line with this?
No. Well, no. I mean, I'm going to get into that in a sec, but
okay.
like I said, introducing this, you like in the start of fully automated luxury communism, he makes all this, he goes to quite extreme lengths to emphasize that, fully automated luxury communism is not a blueprint for a steady state Eden. It's not a place beyond sadness or pain. Like, he's really trying to distance himself from the possibility of someone critiquing fully automated luxury communism as some kind of, secularized version of heaven or the messianic period. Like, he's saying, like, this isn't the end of history. This is just like, some principles that we should fight under, and it's not going to create a perfect society. It's not like, I think Marx, what did Marx say? I think it's in the, is it in the Grundrisse or something? He said, communism is the riddle of history solved and knows itself to be so. Like, what I think Bastani is doing is really trying to distance himself from those kind of teleological sentiments, like the idea that, like, he's proposing a system that's going to forever end, suffering and disagreement and difficulty on the earth. So in one sense, no, I'm not trying to say that it is this kind of secularized religion. Although I do think it has messianic elements to it, which I don't know, like I can talk about, but I don't really have a strong argument to make necessarily. It's just vague thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Well, okay, so yeah, like I said, obviously he goes to some lengths to try to emphasize that fully automated luxury communism isn't meant to be something that solves the riddle of history, like Marx wrote about communism, or the end of history, like Fukuyama wrote about liberal capitalism after the Cold War. But just, in the interests of, flying a kite conceptually here, just thinking about some of this stuff, I think if you do want to draw out the most sort of like messianic aspects of post-capitalism, it's probably in this notion of a post-work society characterized by total abundance. Interestingly, I think Bastani kind of touches on this in an interview where he's talking about the Neolithic agricultural revolution and how it led to Abrahamic religions like Judaism, in which the concept of like the Messianic period or heaven is basically this kind of like spontaneous abundance. I mean, okay, like, yeah. And so his idea is that obviously Judaism has a different idea to heaven as Christianity, and I guess maybe people want to explore that. But so in his estimation, this is because large-scale agriculture led to the first accumulation of massive surpluses, so like granaries storing grain, and so that led to the concept of scarcity. And so because there was a concept of scarcity, there was a concept of abundance, and there was the concept of infinite, eternal abundance, and then that led to these religions, like, you know, Judaism, like early agricultural religions, inventing the idea of heaven as infinite surplus. Yeah, so that's one way of looking at it. Another is that actually, in reality, it wasn't just the conceptual invention of surplus and scarcity, it was that actually sedentary agriculture, at least for a long time, imposed mass scarcity on people who still remembered the greater plenty that they or their ancestors or even nomadic peoples living alongside them enjoyed. That's the argument that I think James C. Scott makes in Against the Grain, which also fits quite nicely onto the materialist reading of the biblical expulsion from the Garden of Eden into a world characterized by toil and labor. Although Eden is perhaps a bit of a romanticized image of nomadic hunter-gatherer societies who often engage in widespread cultivation of landscapes through controlled burning, scattering seeds strategically, or moving around constantly to follow migratory animals. It's not just like chilling in a garden, eating forbidden apples, or whatever. Anyway, so, but that's, yeah, sorry, that's all a side note. Anyway, let's go back to this point that I'm trying to make about the link between you know, post scarcity and post work as probably like the most, I guess, like the aspect of fully automated luxury communism that has the most resonance with these kind of like messianic periods in Abrahamic religions. And so let's talk. So some of the features of this society that Aaron Bastani is envisaging here, and he's drawing kind of quite, you know, he's drawing quite heavily on Marx here, is one, there's going to be like the end of any distinction between labor and leisure, and so I'll just skip that. Okay, so yeah, there's no distinction between labor and leisure. There's also like the distinction between mental and physical labor will vanish, and so work kind of becomes more akin to play, or as Marx would put it, we exit the realm of necessity and we enter the realm of freedom. And so the realm of necessity is where humans kind of wrestle with nature to satisfy our wants and maintain and reproduce life. Because we live in a world defined by scarcity. And so we have to wrestle with these economic questions about how to efficiently and equitably allocate resources. But in contrast, you know, these, you know, communist utopian societies, it's just total realm of freedom. We don't have, the economic question is answered. We don't have to worry about scarcity. There's no economic conflict, but it's just like total abundance, like the Garden of Eden, but more 3D printers. The Garden of Eden, but there's more 3D printers and, you know, annoying dubstep DJs on Spotify, but communist Spotify. So, yeah, there's a good quote here. I'll just read this one quote to kind of illustrate this. And he says, the concept under conditions of scarcity expresses that which is beyond utility, its essence and excess beyond the necessary. So as information, labor, energy, and resources become permanently cheaper and work and the limits of the old world are left behind, it turns out we don't just satisfy all our needs, but dissolve any boundary between the useful and the beautiful. communism is luxurious or it isn't communism. Right. So, yeah. So let me like try to draw a link here between I think there's like a kind of, you know, conceptual link here between the idea of a post-work society and the idea of this kind of like the messianic period as an eternal Sabbath. And so I think, which is interesting, like if you think about this kind of post-work society as a kind of like a Sabbath, like a day of rest that lasts forever. There's as part of fully automated luxury communism, it's interesting in that it combines that in its like sort of like hyper technological way, it combines the way that like Orthodox Jews acknowledge the Sabbath. So I don't know if you know, but there's this whole like kosher gadget industry, and like Orthodox Jews have this like, well, lots of them, you know, have this amazing gadgetry that they deploy, so they can sort of get around the halakhic, like the Jewish like religious requirements of the Sabbath, of not doing work. And there's all this amazing stuff like like phones and alarm systems and like a lamp. And I think even like manufacturers of like ovens, refrigerators, and wine cellars, just general manufacturers have like a kosher setting or a Sabbath mode. And so there's, yeah, they use, it's quite interesting the way that like Orthodox Jews have basically created the fully automated luxury kosher Sabbath through the use of tech. And that I think is one weird resonance between, yeah, that and like the idea of a highly technologized post-work society, but also the sort of more relaxed idea of a weekend, like, or as a Sabbath that like reform, like non-Orthodox Jews like me, or like just general everybody most people in Western societies enjoy, which is kind of like a period of rest that isn't strictly defined by a set of prohibitions about what you can't do. And it's more about the sort of general idea of like freedom and relaxation and doing things that you enjoy doing, and not just what you're sort of bound to do. And so, yeah, I was talking to my housemate about this the other day, and she pointed out that actually eternal Sabbath is a contradiction in terms. Like the Sabbath is only defined by the work week and vice versa. And like, yeah, obviously that's right. Like it's kind of like just wordplay, I guess. Eternal Sabbath is like, in essence, kind of means the destruction of the Sabbath, or the transcending of the division between the Sabbath and the work week, or as like Bastani says, it's like the transcending the division between leisure and labor, in which labor is increasingly automated and your waking hours can be devoted to I guess labor that is non-alienated in Marxist terms, stuff that you want to do. Maybe not totally. Maybe there's still some, there's still some work that has to be done that can be divided equally that people don't want to do, but increasingly it's more and more of that. Yeah. And I wanted to read this kind of beautiful passage from this book to explain this concept of the eternal Sabbath. This is a beautiful book that my grandfather gave to me before he died. It's like an old book of Yiddish stories from like Jewish, Ashkenazi, European Jewish stories. And there's this really beautiful passage in the introduction where he's talking about this idea of the eternal Sabbath. And he says, for the world of the East European Jews, at least in its most serious and ideal manifestations, did not accept the Western distinction between worldly and otherworldly, between that which is due to Caesar and that which is due to God. Kierkegaard's dictum that between God and man there is an infinite yawning qualitative difference might have won their approval as a description of the quality of being, but not as a statement of moral obligation. To be sure, the East European Jews had to abide by the distinction between worldly and otherworldly in order to survive, but they refused to recognize it as just or necessary or inevitable. In their celebration of the Sabbath, and in the sharp line they drew between the Sabbath and the rest of the week, they tacitly recognized that they had to live, however unwillingly, by the ways of the world. But this was the price of exile and dispersion. Ideally, the worldly and otherworldly should be one, and one on earth, penetrating each other to the point of becoming indistinguishable. The Sabbath, goes a Jewish legend, is a foretaste of the world to come, the world in which every day will be a Sabbath. Yeah. So yeah, I think can you see the kind of conceptual comparison I'm trying to make between this idea of the world after the return of the Mashiach, of the world after the return of the Messiah, and you know, communist post-work society? And does anyone have?
Just a comment, but yeah, a friend of mine who used to work 7 days a week, I remember he used to be like, I really hate how people call it working 7 days a week, because it's not 7 days a week, it's just like every day, you know, like you're just working all the time. And yeah, so it kind of reminded me of that, because without the idea of a Sabbath or a break in the week, you know, your life is just work. It's like that Sabbath that gives your week like meaning and structure, and yeah, breaks up the drudgery or something. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I think I've read some things where people kind of worry that a post-work society will just kind of lead to a sort of epidemic of I don't know, like ennui or something, of just general like vague discontent and listlessness, and we sort of, you know, we just kind of won't really know what to do, and actually, you know, this kind of distinction between work and post-work, or the, you know, the doing of unwanted labor is kind of essential to keep us out of trouble. And if we do just have a society in which we can kind of do whatever we want all the time, or, you know, 90% of the time, you know, it's just going to lead to like social chaos. Do you think there's like any, do you give any credence to that idea, or do you think it's just reactionary?
I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I kind of don't, because, well, partially because I've been like trying to live the eternal Sabbath as much as possible for like the last 2 years of my life, and like work as little as possible. And I guess maybe I haven't landed in horrible trouble, maybe, arguably. Like,
I guess
yeah.
it's like over lockdown, how people were like, you know, people who like lost their jobs, or, you know, were stood down or whatever, were like, at first it was really hard, but then, you know, I realized, oh, I had all this time to like spend with my family, and I got to know my kids, and like, you know, yeah.
Like before then,
I guess you know, you also had people like crawling the walls and, you know, going out of, but I guess it's kind of different when you're in a pandemic. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's those, you know, what I think, like what I was saying before, like what we consider paid labor isn't the only labor you know, it means that then you like have time for like care and looking after people close to you, and the cooking for yourself and for others, or for like, it's not like you're not going to be doing anything. You're not.
Yeah.
You know?
Like it's a pretty dim and cynical view of just of humanity. If you think we need 6 or 8 hours of displeasurable labor every day, or else we just turn into just like vacuous, immoral slugs. Like, you know, that's a pretty dim view of humanity. If you think, okay, well, if we don't have, you know, these sort of like regular structures of undesirable work, people are just going to get lazy and listless and immoral, and, you know, they'll be given to vanity and sexual depravity and blah, blah, blah. You know, it's like, I think that's one of the philosophical strengths of this like utopian, like Marxist like ideas, is that they're like, no, it's like, why you don't take a cynical view about like what humans can do or like what we're capable of. Like, imagine if we could have a society where, you know, what, you know, for like, you know, the hours, all of your waking hours, or 90% of your waking hours could be devoted to like things you're passionate about and exploring, you know, connections with other people, or like, you know, and caring for people that you're close to, and like what that could mean for I guess human development or something, or you know, like almost like the remolding of human nature in a post-work world. Like the way that human nature could be radically, you know, obviously human nature doesn't exist really if it's like if it is like something that can be molded by different social circumstances, but like the idea like that what we consider to be human nature could be radically changed in a society in which we have post-scarcity, you know, like that kind of like, I don't know, it's like this kind of like radical optimism about human potential. I think that's something that Bastani is really trying to tap into, and I think it's something that's pretty compelling.
Mm.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I partly think that a lot of work is unnecessary, but that there is an idea that you know, work is partly disciplinary. You see it everywhere in culture. You know, you see I don't know, this idea that work has some kind of spiritual, you know, moral sort of benefit or something, and it's partly a function of like that work is kind of seen as this disciplinary thing that will prevent people from doing all the Hobbesian, you know, things that they might be doing otherwise. But I don't see much evidence of that. You know, it could be that a lot. I think it's more likely that a lot of the nasty things people do are around scarcity. You know, because they need things that they don't have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's also interesting. Like, I wonder, it seems like there's an opportunity, like with this whole pandemic and all, like to rethink work. Like, you know, we're at this point where, you know, because you like, I feel like, you know, obviously it's like a section of the workforce that's, you know, that's able, like office workers and things who are able to work from home. But like, I know in my office, like my boss is very nervous at first about everyone working from home, and made us have these like 9 o'clock meetings every morning, and, you know, just all these like waste of time kind of like things just to check up and see what we were doing. And like, gradually that went back to like 3 days of meetings a week, and then now we just have like one. But yeah, I feel like there was this idea that like, oh, if we're not like monitored and we're not in the office and we're not like all at our desks and you know, then, you know, what are we doing? And the workplace would fall apart. And then, you know, I think he kind of realized that everyone was actually like getting a lot of work done, and you know, and isn't as anxious about that anymore. But it's that like, yeah, I feel like that idea that like you have to be sitting at your desk from 9 to 5, you know, getting the full 8 hours of productivity or something, like is being a little bit eroded now, because yeah. And you do have organizations that are like, you know, monitoring your keystrokes and, you know, all this like things of surveillance. But, you know, I think there's also a realization that people can be productive without being, yeah, constantly.
It's hectic.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. So wait, there's like, it's like when you log on at 9 a.m. in the morning, you have to like, you know, let this program access every single keystroke you make on your laptop.
Yeah, there's like programs that now like monitor, so they can see like what websites you visit, what, yeah, how many keystrokes you're doing. So it's like a way of employers working out if they're like employees working from home are actually working. Yeah, and it's yeah, and it's sorry. What was that?
Microsoft just released is trialing something like this, that you know, because everybody uses Office 365 or whatever, you know, Teams, email, blah 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 blah. You know, it measures your metrics on that and sends it to your manager. You know, how long did it take you to respond to emails, and how much contributions did you make in the Teams and in the video meetings or whatever, and all these metrics get tallied up and sent to managers or whatever. That hasn't been released yet, but I think that that's definitely the future, and that will be maybe a way of keeping discipline in a sort of like work from home scenario, I guess.
There's definitely some of those products already being used. Yeah, but I think like, yeah, like obviously like a good manager is like, okay, well, this person isn't doing that many keystrokes, but you know, like they're spending today like reviewing papers, so they're like reading. So, you know, like if you're but yeah, it's just because obviously like work that you do doesn't, the time you spend like reading or thinking or like mapping something out like in your head doesn't translate to like keystrokes. And so there's like a lot of problems with that, you know, many different levels. But yeah.
I mean, if I guess this doesn't apply to all jobs, but if, you know, if you have an employee and they have a very well-defined role that has like measurable, you know, like measurable tasks that they need to do, it's like you don't really need to have any of those methods of surveillance, right? They could just be like, all right, you know, Rachel, you need to be ready to argue this case in front of the Fair Work Commission on Friday, and we're going to know if you're not prepared. So, you know, we don't need to like monitor your keystrokes. It's just like you do have a clearly defined task, which I guess, yeah, would be, you know, a more humane way of giving people more freedom at work, right? Because you'd be like, okay, well, in one sense, yeah, it could be seen as more humane because it's like, okay, I'm not being like, you know, there's not this panopticon of surveillance, but also, you know, the whole idea of paying people by task and not by hour has a lot of problems in like freelance work. You know, like the freelance work that I do, like, you know, I spend 20 hours writing an article and I get paid, $200 for it. I mean, partly that's just because of like the declining profitability of media, but yeah. So I'm not trying to say that like task based as opposed to hour based, employment is some like amazing progressive step. Obviously, it's like got massive problems if you look at like what's happening in the digital freelance sector. But yeah, I guess if like you're on an hourly wage, but the only mechanism of monitoring is about tasks and not keystrokes, maybe that's like a good kind of like more humane balance of like monitoring work, in a world in which maybe, yeah, people can stay home more. Because that seems to be like the big thing that lots of people are saying from COVID. They're like, oh, wow, I didn't need to come into work for this meeting. This was just like a 200-word email that you could have sent. There's a lot of
time you waste at work. Like I went into the office the other day and like a couple of my colleagues were in there and they were just like talking to me. And it was like an hour of like, the day gone. I'm like, yeah. But yeah. But I think I think the problem with that kind of, I think you're right that the problem with that kind of surveillance is that it does shift. It can, and it does in a lot of cases already, like shift from like kind of remunerating like workers based on tasks. And you see that like with Uber drivers, like how when they're not like like logging on and off and only being paid for the rides that they do and not all the time like they spent waiting, that's like using technology to chip away at pay. And even now like with home care and like aged care, like in Australia, a lot of organizations use these apps, and so you have to kind of like log onto the app in the morning and like drive to the house where you're caring for an older person, like do the tasks and then log off and get them to approve it or whatever. And then you're not paid for the time you're spent driving to your next client. You're not paid for the time you spend like writing up notes or telling the next carer like what that client needs. So that's like a big problem with with the use of technology that doesn't actually, it does the opposite of like liberating people from work. It actually increases their it's automation, but it services the boss and capital and puts the risks and costs on the worker.
This highlights an interesting problem that the fully luxury automated communism, arrives at, which is that while the imagination is something, I don't know, Star Trek or something, there isn't actually that many science fictional images to reach for. But in practice, increasing technology in the workplace often means increasing like monitoring and control. You can even imagine like a sort of sinister UBI or something where like, you get a UBI, but like it's all monitored and you have to spend it on a specialized card, and it's only like valid at Coles, certain supermarkets or something like that. And the statistics are all gathered.
You're just describing the basics card.
Well, the basics card,
Australian welfare basically uses in some areas, right?
Yeah. So I think that what that highlights is like, again, it's like the ownership problem, which is that like the fully automated luxury communism, like imaginary, like lacks a bit of it sort of seems like you can accelerate just purely by accelerating the into post-scarcity and getting more energy than you need, more production than you need, and whatnot. You will end up with these outcomes or something. obviously they're writing books and they view changing consciousness around work and whatnot is essential to it. But it almost seems like there also has to be like a politics around it or something of like what kind of technologies and when are they like monitoring you and what happens to your privacy. It's not like all those sort of problems disappear, and maybe they're sort of shunted to the side a little in the utopianism. Although, again, I still remain like sympathetic to this vision, and I wish the left would come around to it a bit more. But yeah, it seems like a lot of automation and increased technologization generally just means increased control. Like, you know, if you implemented that kind of productivity stuff at my workplace, it would really decrease, like, it would really be awful, I think, you know. It would kind of, you could easily see what would happen, which would reward people that do very fast, sloppy work. And then you have all these other people that were fixing up the mistakes that they were doing, but whose work wouldn't get counted or something, you know what I mean? Anyway.
No, it's, yeah, that's exactly what happens. Like the kind of, like writing reports. I think the example Rachel was bringing up before was like maybe like aged care, but the same thing happened in disability. Like I've worked in disability for like, you know, like, I don't know, 8 years or something on and off. And the same thing happened where like I was expected to write reports about people in my sort of home hours when I wasn't being paid. And I think that just is inevitably going to lead to people kind of rushing notes that these kind of, you know, these report backs. Okay, so John today was pretty good, but I noticed that he had a really negative reaction to this and that, you know, all these kind of like what would be useful information that people like coordinating an intellectually disabled person's care program. Like they really want to have as much information as possible. But if you disincentivize care workers from writing detailed reports by not paying them for the time in which they're writing those reports, you're going to end up with like a shitty product if the product your company is providing is, you know, a care for this person with an intellectual disability. So yeah, like it's not even efficient by its own metrics, and well, it's efficient by its own metrics in terms of it's cheap and I get paid less for doing the work, but it's not. The product it's delivering is inferior. And to go back to the other thing you said, Peter, about like it seemed like you were sort of saying that Bastani, that fully automated luxury communism isn't really wrestling with this question of like the fact that this technology has a dark side. I maybe I haven't given that impression enough in my sort of summary of it today, but he does in the book. I think in the book, if you do have a fair reading of it, he does really, like, he's not a technological determinist. He's not like, these technologies lead to communism and utopia and that's just it. Like, he's like, no, these technologies lead to dystopia unless you have an organized, powerful left shaping the trajectory of these technologies towards certain social ends. So yeah, I don't think, yeah, it would be a fair reading of him to say that, yeah, he's just this kind of like technological determinist that thinks that there's no downsides to these technologies potentially. Yeah, he's very much like, no, it's about the social conditions in which these technologies are developed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I'll have to look at the book, get it from the library. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't really know if I have anything more to say. Don't really know if I have anything more to say. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'll just play some music for the last half an hour. Got half an hour to go. I mean, I do have like hundreds and thousands, or 20,000 words of notes. Haven't probably only read half of them, but I'm kind of tired. Yeah. Let me quickly go to song.
I might head out, Zach. Thanks for the chat, though. Really appreciated talking about these ideas.
Yeah. I'll send you a link to. I'll send you the Stuart Brand thing.
Yeah,
But
great.
yeah, thanks for coming and chatting.
That's okay. Thanks.
All right. See ya.
Cuando la reanimó dal campo salía, miraba en el cielo y en la estrella, vido luz santa en la judería que había de nacer Abraham Avinu, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham Avinu, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. La mujer de Terach quedó preñada, de día en día le preguntaba, ¿de qué tenés la cara tan demudada? Ella ya sabía el bien que tenía. Abraham Avinu, Padre querido, Padre
Sag je revenue, was wird sein, als der Vakzin wird kommen? Als der Vakzin wird kommen, wollen wir machen Asylum. Und wer wird uns anladen zum Verdingen auf der Asylum? Tammy, die Macher von Grundmacklers. Tammy, die Macher von Grundmacklers. Tammy, die Macher wird anladen zu uns zum Verdingen auf der Asylum. Und wer wird nehmen sich zu verrichten auf der Asylum? Moschiach, Moschiach. Moschiach wird nehmen sich zu verrichten. Tammy, die Macher wird anladen uns zum Verdingen auf der Asylum. Und wer wird da gucken, dem Gezettel läuft der zu den New. Peter, Daton, die Paskudnik. Peter, Daton, die Paskudnik. Peter, Daton, wird da gucken, dem Gezettel. Moschiach wird nehmen sich zu das verrichten. Tammy, die Macher wird uns anladen, uns zum Verdingen. If there's Sudan you. Und wer wird klingen der Polizei auf der Sudan you? Dan Andrews der Brav. Dan Andrews der Brav. Dan Andrews der Brav wird klingen der Polizei. Peter, Datum, Wetter, gucken dem Gezettel. Moschiach wird nehmen sich zu das verrichten. Tammy, die Macher wird anladen uns zum Verdingen auf der Sudan you. Und wer wird uns Chochme sagen auf der Sudan you? Der Sudan you. Und wer wird uns bringen, der Maschira drive der Sudan you. Friedenberg, der Reaganomic-Share. Friedenberg, der Reaganomic-Share. Wird uns abbringen, dem Chirurg. Serena Russell wird uns Hoffmann sorgen. Dan Andrews, der Braut wird und klingen der Polizei. Peter, Datum wird da gucken, dem Gezettel. Moschiach wird nehmen sich zu verrichten. Tammy, die Macher wird und laden uns zum Verdingen auf der Sudan.
I'm unmuted. So, thank you. That was fun. I just played music for the last half an hour, but before then we had a very long, interesting talk about utopian left futurism. That was, yeah, my 4 hours of the 72-hour Lucky Jewathon. And next we have, I'll just do a very, very brief introduction. It is Jacob Nowakowski, who is, I believe, the director of the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry if I got that wrong. Is that correct?
No, it's very true. So nice meeting you, and thanks so much for the lovely introduction, both in terms of the words and the music.
Cool. Okay. Well, over to you, Jacob.